I was 35 years old the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip through Central Oregon. It was late July of 2021, and I had been working a remote IT job from my small apartment in Portland. The burnout had crept in slowly over the months. Staring at screens all day, barely talking to anyone in person, going through the same routines every single day. I wanted silence, some sort of reset, and I figured a solo camping trip would give me just that. I picked a place about 5 hours southeast of Portland, near a lesser-known spot called Todd Ridge, about 15 miles off the nearest paved road. It wasn't a national park, just a huge patch of forest on BLM land, mostly used by hunters in the fall. I found it using an old hiking forum where someone mentioned it was quiet, isolated, and had a flat area perfect for tents near a shallow creek. That's all I needed. I left early on a Thursday morning. I brought enough supplies to last 4 days. Tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, water filtration pump, freeze-dried meals, power bank, and even a book I never actually opened. I also had my phone, which I knew would lose signal well before I got close. I downloaded offline maps just in case and saved GPS coordinates of the spot. I had no plans to move around much once I got there. The drive was long and a little rough toward the end. The last 20 miles were all dirt roads. My old Subaru could handle it, but there were spots where I had to go real slow to avoid scraping the undercarriage on uneven gravel. It took a full hour just to cover those last miles. When I finally parked, I was already feeling the distance from the world. No other cars, no buildings, no sound except wind moving through the trees and the soft trickle of the creek a few hundred feet away. I hiked my gear in about half a mile from the dirt road, following a thin game trail. The spot was just as described. Flat ground, a bit of tree cover, the creek close enough for water but far enough not to hear it constantly. I pitched my tent just before dusk and boiled water for a dehydrated chili meal. The temperature dropped fast once the sun went down, and by 9 I was zipped into my sleeping bag, staring at the top of the tent, listening to the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind against leaves. The first night was peaceful. I woke up around 6 a.m. to light breaking through the tent fabric and a heavy layer of dew on everything. My boots were cold and damp when I slipped them on. I made coffee on the stove and sat by the creek for an hour, just watching the water slide over the rocks. That whole day I did very little. Walked around the area, looked for dry wood, stretched out in the shade. It was exactly the kind of quiet I had been needing, but something shifted that evening. It was a little after sundown when I was finishing dinner. I had just dumped the water from cleaning my pot about 20 feet from camp, down a small slope. I turned to head back to the tent and noticed something odd. There were fresh prints in the dirt near where I'd been walking earlier. They weren't animal prints, they looked like boot treads. The thing was, they weren't mine. I checked by stepping beside them. Different sole pattern, different size. Slightly wider and maybe a size larger than mine. I stood there for a minute, just staring at the ground. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees watching me, but there was no one. I tried to tell myself maybe they were old, left there by a hunter months ago, and just hadn't been washed away by the last rain. But they looked fresh, edges crisp, no debris settled into them. I went to bed unsettled. Every tiny sound outside the tent made me sit up and listen. There were a lot of little noises in the woods, but none sounded human. Still, I kept my bear spray close to my sleeping bag and didn't fall asleep until after midnight. The next morning, I checked the area again. The prints were still there, and now there were new ones a little further along the slope. Same size, same tread. I didn't remember hearing anything during the night. The dirt was soft near the creek, so it was easy to leave tracks, and these looked even fresher. I got a weird feeling in my stomach, like something was slowly tightening inside me. I walked in circles around my campsite for an hour, looking for other prints, signs of anything. About 50 yards away, I found what looked like a flattened spot of grass, like someone had stood there a while, just past the tree line. I couldn't be sure, but it didn't look like it was made by an animal lying down. It was too narrow, too cleanly shaped. I kept debating whether to pack up and leave. But it was only my second full day, and I'd driven all this way. Still felt like overreacting, so I stayed. The day passed slow. I kept close to camp, my knife on my belt the whole time. I collected firewood even though I hadn't built a fire the night before. I figured it might help to have one that night, something about light making me feel less exposed. As the sun dropped, I lit it and sat next to it for hours, just feeding sticks into the flames and watching the woods. I heard rustling, but never saw anything. I went to bed again after midnight, fully dressed inside my bag, bear spray and knife within reach. At some point in the night, I heard something outside the tent. It wasn't an animal stepping on leaves or twigs. It was slower, more deliberate. I froze. I didn't move a muscle. I just lay there, ears straining to hear every little sound. The steps were soft, spaced out, moving around the perimeter of my tent. Then they stopped. I lay there in total silence for what felt like an hour. Then I heard a soft, low sound, almost like something being dragged slowly across dirt. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. Everything looked normal, but I could feel it wasn't. The dirt just outside the tent was disturbed. There were faint drag marks, like someone had run a stick or maybe even their foot along the ground in a curve. A few boot prints too, near the trees. That was it. I was done. I packed my gear as fast as I could. I didn't even make coffee. I skipped breakfast, shoved everything into my pack haphazardly, and started hiking back to the car. The trail back felt longer than I remembered. Every snap of a twig behind me made me turn around. The woods were still and quiet in that way that makes you feel like you're being watched. I stopped twice to catch my breath, and both times thought I saw movement through the trees, but it could have just been my nerves. Or maybe it wasn't. When I finally reached the car, I threw everything in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I sat there for a few seconds with my hands gripping the wheel, trying to calm myself. I turned the ignition, and the engine started like normal. Relief washed over me, but only for a moment. As I started to back out, I noticed something off to the side of the dirt road. About 50 feet away, tucked behind a tree, was an old blue cooler. It looked beat up, sun-faded, out of place. I hadn't seen it on the way in. I stopped the car and stared at it. The top was closed, but something about it gave me a bad feeling in my chest. It didn't belong there. I didn't get out to look. I didn't want to know what was in it. I just drove. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. My phone got service about 20 minutes later, and I called a friend just to hear someone's voice. I didn't tell them what happened, just that I cut the trip short. When I got home that evening, I unpacked everything in my small living room and checked my gear. That's when I noticed something that made my skin go cold. The small zippered pouch I kept my water purification tablets in was unzipped. I never unzipped it during the trip. I had used the filter pump the whole time. The pouch was always in the same place, inside a side pocket of my pack, zipped shut. But it wasn't just open, it was empty. The tablets were gone. I dumped the whole pack out. Nothing. I searched every compartment. Still nothing. I don't know when they went missing. I hadn't checked that pouch since day one. I didn't go back to the woods after that. I started taking walks in city parks instead. I stopped browsing camping forums. I gave most of my gear to Goodwill and sold the rest online. I think about that trip a lot, especially at night when everything's quiet. I don't know who was out there or why they watched me. I don't know if they were just messing with me, or if it could have gone a different way if I had stayed one more night. What I do know is that someone was there. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who got close enough to unzip a pouch inside my bag without me noticing. That's enough for me. It was late September of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the Pine Lake Forest in northern Idaho. I had just turned 33 a few weeks earlier and had been feeling weighed down by work and city life. I worked long hours at a mechanical engineering firm in Boise and lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment. Everything felt repetitive, waking up, commuting, working, eating alone, sleeping, and repeating it all over again. I hadn't taken any time off in nearly a year, and I could feel the burnout creeping in like a slow fog. So I used a week of unused vacation days, packed up my gear, and made the 5-hour drive up to the woods. I'd been to Pine Lake once before when I was a teenager with my dad. That trip had been one of the few good memories I had with him before he passed. I remembered how quiet the forest was, how the lake seemed to reflect everything like glass, and how the night sky showed more stars than I'd ever seen. I figured returning to that place might reset something in me, maybe bring me back to a quieter headspace. I brought a 4-person tent even though I was alone. It gave me more room to stretch out and store my gear inside. I also packed a bear canister, food for 5 days, a propane stove, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a first aid kit, a small hatchet, water purification tablets, and a portable solar charger for emergencies. I also had my GPS and a paper map just in case. I had spent years doing day hikes, but this was one of the few times I planned on camping alone deep in the woods. I parked my truck at a small turnout off a dirt road. The trail I chose wasn't popular. It was an old Forest Service trail that had been unofficially maintained by hikers and hunters. I walked for about 2 hours into the woods before I found a flat, clear area about half a mile from the northern edge of the lake. There were no other campsites or signs of people, just forest, thick trees, soft pine needles on the ground, and the faint sound of water trickling somewhere nearby. I set up my tent near a cluster of old pines, facing east so I'd get some morning light. The first day was peaceful. I walked down to the lake in the afternoon, followed a narrow game trail for a bit, and found animal tracks, mostly deer and raccoon. I boiled water for dinner and ate alone as the light dimmed behind the trees. The forest got very still at night. I'd forgotten how much darker it got without city lights. The only light came from my small lantern and the stars overhead. I stayed up for a while listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, owls, and sometimes distant rustling. I wasn't scared, just very aware of how alone I was. The second day, I explored more around my campsite. I followed a ridge to the west and saw the lake from above. The water was still and dark, and I could see small fish near the surface when I got closer. I made notes in a small journal I brought, mostly about the weather and terrain. That night, I was woken up by the sound of branches snapping. I stayed very still in my sleeping bag and listened. The sounds were slow and heavy, like something large walking through the woods. I assumed it was a deer or maybe a moose. I had seen signs of both nearby. The sounds eventually faded, and I fell back asleep. The third day, things started to feel strange. In the morning, I noticed a few scuff marks near my tent. At first, I thought maybe an animal had wandered too close during the night. But the marks weren't like paw prints or hooves. They looked like worn shoe soles, maybe boots. I tried to tell myself it could have been old marks that I hadn't noticed when setting up camp. But something about them seemed fresh. I walked around the area for a bit, but didn't see any other signs of people. No wrappers, no gear, no prints leading toward or away from the site. Later that day, while hiking along the tree line on the southern side of the lake, I found something that didn't belong. It was a single glove, a thick winter glove, black, lying palm up near the base of a tree. I picked it up and looked around, but there was no one in sight. No footprints, no trail, no sign of struggle or animal activity. It was just there. I left it where I found it and headed back to camp before sunset. That night, the forest felt different. It was quieter than usual. Too quiet. Even the crickets were silent. I kept my lantern on inside the tent longer than usual and listened for any sound. I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing light rustling, intermittent, like someone trying not to make noise. At one point, I thought I saw movement outside my tent. A shadow passed near the edge of the tent wall, barely visible in the dim lantern light. Could have been a branch moving, but there was no wind. I held my breath and waited, gripping the small hatchet I kept near my sleeping bag. The movement didn't return, and eventually the silence returned. I didn't sleep for more than an hour that night. In the morning, I found more prints, clearer this time. Boot prints, large ones, just outside my tent. They circled the area once, stopped near where I stored my food, then disappeared back into the trees. I knew they hadn't been there the day before. The pine needles had been disturbed recently, the edges of the prints sharp. Someone had been walking around my camp in the night. I looked in all directions, scanned the forest, but saw no one. I decided to cut the trip short. I packed up my gear fast, trying to stay calm. The forest suddenly felt hostile, like it was closing in on me. I hadn't seen another person in 3 days, and now there were signs someone had been close, watching. I started the hike back toward my truck, moving faster than I normally would. Every time I stopped to drink water or check the map, I felt like I was being watched. I didn't hear anything unusual, but the feeling wouldn't go away. About a mile from the trailhead, I heard it, branches breaking behind me. Not once, but several times at intervals. I stopped and crouched, listening. It wasn't an animal. The steps were careful, slow, but steady. I turned and saw movement through the trees, too far to make out clearly, but tall and upright. Human. They ducked behind a trunk when I looked. I didn't call out. I didn't want to know who it was. I started moving again, faster this time, borderline jogging. I didn't stop until I saw my truck through the trees. When I got there, the driver's door was slightly ajar. I never leave it that way. My stomach dropped. I looked inside. The glove compartment was open, papers scattered. Nothing major was missing. Wallet, keys, and tools were still there, but someone had gone through it. I threw my gear in the back seat and started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town nearly 90 minutes later. I reported everything to the local sheriff's department. They listened, took some notes, and said they'd send someone to check the area. But they didn't seem too concerned. No known missing people, no reports of others in the woods. They said it might have been a hunter or a drifter. Maybe. I never got a follow-up call. It's been years since that trip. I haven't gone camping alone again. I still hike, still go into the woods sometimes, but never too far from populated trails. The strange thing is, I still think about that glove, just lying there in the woods like someone had left it on purpose. Sometimes I wonder if someone was living out there, deep in the forest, far from anyone else, watching people who came too close. But what stays with me more than anything is the silence from that third night. The kind of silence that doesn't feel natural. I think whoever was out there wanted me to leave, and they made sure I did. I've got security cameras at my place now. I lock my truck every time, double-check the doors, always look over my shoulder in parking lots. Maybe it's paranoia, maybe not, but I know what I saw. I know someone followed me. I know they were close enough to touch the tent, and they never made a sound. I was 32 when I decided to take a solo camping trip out to a remote area in Oregon. It was late September of 2019, just before the weather started to turn cold. I had been working long hours at my job in Eugene and needed a break from the constant noise and people. I'd been on a few camping trips before, but always with friends. This time, I wanted to go alone, just to get away from everything and think for a while. I packed light, just the basics. A small one-man tent, a sleeping bag, cooking gear, some canned food, a water purifier, a flashlight, a headlamp, and a foldable knife. I also brought a printed map of the area and a compass. I didn't want to rely on GPS because I knew that where I was going, service would be almost non-existent. I chose a place I'd never been to before, an old Forest Service trail about 3 hours southeast of Oak Ridge. It was rarely used anymore, but I found some old posts on a hiking forum about it being peaceful and good for solitude. I drove out early on a Friday morning and parked my car at the end of a gravel road that used to be maintained but had clearly been forgotten. Weeds grew in the center line of the path, and the edges were creeping in. I locked the car and started walking into the woods. The trailhead wasn't marked, but I followed the path described online. The first few miles were beautiful. The trail was narrow and overgrown in spots, but I could still follow it. Huge trees towered above me, mostly Douglas firs and some old pines. There were fallen logs across the trail here and there, but nothing I couldn't climb over. I saw no signs of anyone else. No boot prints, no litter, just the sounds of birds and the occasional squirrel darting through the underbrush. After about 5 miles, I found a small clearing next to a shallow stream. The water was clear and cold, and I could hear it running softly over the rocks. It looked like the perfect place to set up camp. I pitched my tent in the flattest spot I could find, just a few yards from the stream. I built a small fire ring with some stones and gathered dry wood from the surrounding forest. By late afternoon, I had everything set up. I sat by the fire as the sun went down. The forest was quiet, but not in a creepy way. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel small, like the trees had been there long before you and would stay long after. I had a simple dinner, just a can of chili heated over the flames, and watched the sky turn pink and then deep blue. I turned in early that night, tired from the hike. I zipped myself into the sleeping bag and listened to the wind in the trees. I don't remember falling asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. It was the kind of waking that doesn't come from a dream, but from something external. I lay there in the dark, listening. At first, I heard nothing unusual, just the wind, a few creaks from the trees, maybe an owl in the distance. But then I heard a soft crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. Came from somewhere behind the tent, maybe 20 feet away. I held my breath and listened. Another soft sound. This time it was more like something brushing against leaves or low branches. I stayed completely still. I didn't have any weapons aside from the small folding knife, and that was in my backpack outside the tent. I waited. Minutes passed. The noises stopped. I eventually convinced myself it might have been a deer or maybe even a raccoon. I tried to go back to sleep, but it was a light, uneasy sleep from that point on. The next morning, the forest looked the same as it had the day before. Nothing felt out of place. I walked around a bit, checking the area behind the tent where I'd heard the sounds. I saw no prints, no disturbed ground. Nothing looked touched. I figured it had to be an animal. I made breakfast, filtered more water from the stream, and went on a short hike up a ridge about a mile east of camp. From the top, I could see miles of forest in all directions. No roads, no cabins, no smoke, just trees and hills. I didn't see or hear anyone. That second night, I built another fire and sat beside it, feeling more relaxed. The day had been peaceful, and I figured I'd just been on edge the night before because I wasn't used to camping alone. When the fire burned low, I went into the tent and zipped myself in again. The sleeping bag was warm, and I started to drift off, listening to the quiet stream and the wind in the trees. Sometime later, I don't know what time it was, I woke up again. This time it was different. The air felt colder, and I had the same immediate sense of being watched. I didn't move, I just listened. The wind had died down. Everything was still. I heard a low noise, so quiet I thought I might be imagining it, like a slow shuffle through dry leaves. It stopped. Then, a few seconds later, another sound, closer this time. A footstep, definite, heavy, not an animal. I stayed frozen, heart pounding in my chest. I reached out slowly and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. It was dark, but the moon gave off a little light. I didn't see anything at first. Then movement, just at the edge of the clearing. A figure, standing still, watching. I couldn't make out any features. They weren't holding a flashlight. No bag, no gear, just standing. I blinked, thinking maybe I was seeing things. But when I looked again, the shape was still there. I ducked back into the tent and zipped it shut silently. I didn't know what to do. My phone was in the tent, but there was no service out here. I had no weapon on me. I lay there in the dark, barely breathing. For at least an hour, I didn't hear anything. Then, just as quietly as it came, the presence was gone. I unzipped the tent again slowly and looked out. Nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, waiting for dawn. As soon as the first light came through the trees, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't bother cooking breakfast. I just shoved the gear into my bag and started hiking back the way I came. My legs felt stiff and my nerves were shot. I kept glancing over my shoulder as I walked, certain I'd see that figure again. But I didn't. I reached the car around noon and got in, locking the doors before I even started the engine. I drove straight back to town without stopping. When I got home, I checked the hiking forum where I'd found the trail. I scrolled through the posts again. One caught my eye that I hadn't noticed before. It was a reply on an old thread. Someone had written, "Went out there last year, didn't stay long, got the feeling I wasn't alone." No explanation, no follow-up, just that. I tried to sleep that night but kept seeing that figure in my mind, standing just outside the firelight. I never went camping alone again after that. I started locking my doors more often, checking windows, being more aware of my surroundings. A few months later, I saw a short article in a local paper about a hunter who'd gone missing in that same general area. They never found him, just his truck parked at the end of a trail. They said he might have gotten lost or fallen somewhere off the path, but searchers never found any signs. I don't know if it was the same trail. I never went back to check. I still go camping sometimes, but only in well-trafficked areas, and always with other people. I still think about that figure, whoever it was, whatever they wanted. I try to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe someone else out there doing the same thing I was. Maybe just someone passing through. But it didn't feel that way. It felt like they had been watching for a long time. And I had no idea they were there until it was almost too late. I was 32 that summer, and I needed a break more than anything. I had just left a job I hated after 5 years of dragging myself through it, and everything in my life felt stuck. I lived in Fort Worth, Texas, but I grew up in the Northwest, and I missed the forests and the cold air. I needed to get away from all the noise and pressure, even if it was just for a few days. I remembered a small lake in northern Idaho where my uncle used to take me fishing when I was a kid. It wasn't a known spot, not listed on most hiking apps, just a quiet body of water tucked between pine-covered hills. We used to camp on the west side of it where the ground leveled out a bit. I hadn't been back in over 20 years. It was late September 2023. Most people were done camping for the year, so I figured it'd be empty. I packed my gear in the back of my Subaru Outback: tent, sleeping bag, propane stove, food, water, hatchet, knife, first aid kit, the basics. I brought my old Ruger 10-20 rifle too, just in case I needed it, not expecting to but figuring it was better to have it. I didn't plan to hike deep into the backcountry. I just wanted to sit by the lake, fish a little, breathe air that didn't smell like exhaust and office carpet glue, and remember what silence felt like. The drive up took most of the day. I stopped in Sandpoint for gas and a sandwich, then took a series of old forest roads that twisted and climbed for nearly 2 hours. The last leg was slow-going, gravel, ruts, fallen branches, but I remembered the way well enough. When I finally parked near the same turnout we used back then, it was just after 5 p.m. The sun was starting to dip behind the ridge, casting long shadows through the trees. I didn't see a single person the entire drive up. That felt like a good sign at the time. I set up camp quickly. I pitched the tent under the same big cedar I remembered from childhood. It had a thick trunk and deep roots that made the ground a little bumpy but kept rainwater from pooling. I unpacked my gear and walked down to the lake with a small rod. The water was calm and dark, only disturbed by an occasional ripple. The air smelled like wet pine and earth. I felt better just being there, like I had finally stepped out of my own head. I stayed up until the stars came out, then went back to the tent. I read for a while using my headlamp, then turned it off and lay there listening to the forest. No cars, no phones, just wind in the trees and the occasional crack of a twig somewhere nearby. I slept well that first night. The next day was perfect. Bright, chilly morning. I made coffee and sat on a log watching steam rise off the lake. I fished a little and caught nothing. Didn't care. I walked along the waterline and found a few old fire rings from what must have been campers long before me. They were filled with ashes and moss. I kicked through one and found a rusted spoon. It looked like it had been there for years. Late that afternoon, I spotted something across the lake, something small and white moving through the trees. It was quick, like a flash of movement, then gone. I stared at the spot for a few minutes but saw nothing else. Maybe it was a deer or a rabbit. There were no trails that led to that side of the lake that I knew of. It was steeper there, and thick with underbrush. Not the kind of place someone would hike unless they were bushwhacking. That night, I built a fire and made dinner. I brought freeze-dried stuff, nothing fancy. The stars came out again, bright and sharp against the black sky. I didn't think about the white thing much. figured it was just a trick of light or some animal. The fire burned down, and I crawled into the tent and zipped myself in. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound, a branch snapping, not the usual tiny crackle of a falling twig. This was louder, heavier, like someone had stepped on it. I stayed still, eyes open in the dark. The moon was out, and the tent walls glowed faintly. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. There was another sound, leaves shifting, then nothing. I waited a long time, heart thudding. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a raccoon or maybe a porcupine. They made weird noises when they moved through brush. I drifted off again and slept until the morning light made the tent glow orange. I stepped out and walked the perimeter of my campsite. I didn't see anything unusual. No tracks, no trash scattered. Everything was exactly how I left it. Still, the unease hung around. Around noon, I decided to hike around the lake and explore the far side. I packed a small day bag, knife, water, protein bar, GPS, and followed the shoreline. The trail faded quickly. I had to push through underbrush, step over roots, and duck under branches. It was slow going. Halfway around, I found a large flat rock that stuck out into the water. I sat there for a while, ate the bar, and looked back at my camp on the other side. I could barely see the tent through the trees. That's when I noticed something that made me freeze. There were boot prints near the edge of the rock. Fresh ones, not mine. They were deeper and wider than the ones I'd made coming up. They pointed toward the woods, not toward the lake. Whoever left them had been standing near the edge, looking out toward my side. I scanned the woods behind me, every muscle tense. I didn't see anyone, but the hairs on my neck stood up. I backed away slowly, then started making my way back the way I came, not taking the same path in case someone had seen me. I moved as quietly as I could, circling wide, and came back into camp from a different angle about 30 minutes later. Nothing had changed. Tent was untouched. No signs of anyone. Still, I knew what I saw. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going low and sat beside it with the rifle across my lap. Every little noise made me twitch. The wind picked up just after midnight, making the trees groan and sway. I thought I heard something moving out there a few times, but I couldn't be sure. At first light, I decided to cut the trip short and leave. I packed up quickly, kept the rifle close, and loaded everything into the car. The road was rough going down, and I had to stop once to clear a fallen branch. When I reached the paved road, I finally felt my body relax a little. But I wasn't done. The feeling I had out there, the sense that someone was nearby watching, didn't go away. Even after I made it to a small diner in Bonner's Ferry and sat with a hot coffee and a plate of eggs, I felt it. That nagging pull in the back of my mind, like I'd missed something important, like someone had been closer than I'd realized. It wasn't until 2 weeks later, back home, that I got some confirmation. I had uploaded a few trail cam photos I'd taken on a whim, mostly shots of trees and the lake. I didn't expect to see anything interesting, but in one of them, taken on the second night just before I went to sleep, there was a figure in the distance, just barely visible between two trees on the far side of the lake. White shirt, standing still, facing the camera. I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, but it was there. I reported it to the local Forest Service, sent them the photo, and gave them the GPS coordinates of where I camped. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but I never heard back. I didn't push it. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still get out in nature, still hike and fish when I can, but never solo. Not anymore. Something about the way those boot prints pointed toward the lake, the way that figure stood so still in the photo, like they were waiting. I can't forget it. I wasn't attacked. I wasn't followed home, but someone was out there. Someone knew I was there, and for some reason they didn't want to be seen until they let themselves be. That was enough for me. I was 33 when I decided to take a solo camping trip up near the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. It was early October, 2022. I've been living in Raleigh for the last 10 years, working in IT support, and honestly, I just needed a break from the screens and noise. My girlfriend had moved out 3 months earlier, and things had felt quiet in a bad way ever since. I wanted to clear my head, be out in the open for a few days, cook over a fire, and sleep under a thick blanket of stars. Just the idea of it felt like something I needed more than wanted. I picked a spot in the Jefferson National Forest. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I found on a hiking forum. A few people had left notes saying it was peaceful, good space for a tent, near a little stream. It was far enough from any roads that I knew it wouldn't be busy, which was exactly what I was looking for. I packed my old green hiking backpack with enough food for 3 days, mostly dry stuff like oatmeal packets, jerky, a few instant noodle packs. I brought a camp stove, water purification tablets, my cheap but trusty tent, a sleeping bag rated for 30 degrees, and a small hatchet for firewood. I also brought my old Nikon DSLR, hoping to get some fall foliage photos. Leaves were just starting to turn. The drive took a little over 4 hours. The last bit was on a dirt road that seemed to go forever, winding uphill with no signs, just trees on both sides. When the road finally ended, I parked off to the side in a small gravel turnout and started hiking the trail on foot. It was quiet, and the air had that crisp smell you only get in early fall. I kept my pace slow, enjoying the sounds of the woods, bird calls, the crunch of dry leaves under my boots, the faint sound of a stream somewhere off in the distance. I had downloaded a GPS map ahead of time, but I tried not to look at it too much. I wanted to feel like I was away from all that, even if I still had my phone turned off in my bag just in case. The clearing was just like the photos. A small flat space surrounded by tall, skinny trees, mostly oaks and maples, with just enough room for a single tent and a fire pit someone had built up with stones. The stream was maybe 30 yards away, just over a small slope. I spent the first hour gathering dead wood and setting up my tent. The sun was already getting low, casting long shadows that moved slow across the forest floor. I set up the fire and boiled some water for noodles. After eating, I sat by the fire with my jacket zipped all the way up, watching the flames dance. The stars came out clear and sharp. No clouds, no sounds except for the occasional rustle from somewhere in the brush. Probably squirrels or something bigger like deer. Nothing that worried me. I slept surprisingly well. The second day started off great. I hiked a few miles deeper into the forest with my camera, took some decent shots of the changing trees, a small waterfall I didn't expect to find, and even got a few frames of a red-tailed hawk flying low over the ridge. I made it back to camp around 4, tired but happy. I made another fire and boiled more water for dinner. As the sun dropped, I started feeling this strange unease. It wasn't anything clear or specific, just a quiet awareness. Like I was being watched, or like something had changed. I looked around the clearing, scanned the tree line, but saw nothing. Just trees, shadows, and the last gold streaks of sunset. Later that night, sometime after midnight, I woke up to a faint noise. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, trying to place it. First, it sounded like rustling leaves. Then it sounded more like something moving through the brush. A slow, heavy tread. Not constant. Just 1 or 2 steps, then nothing. Then a few more. I didn't move. I kept breathing as quietly as I could. My tent was zipped shut, and I had my headlamp within reach, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to make noise. The footsteps stopped after maybe a minute. I didn't hear anything after that. I stayed awake for hours, listening. At some point, I must have fallen back asleep. When I woke up, it was just getting light. The fire pit was cold. My breath was fogging in the morning air, and the woods looked the same as before. But I still had that feeling, like something was off. I got out of the tent and walked a slow circle around the clearing. That's when I saw the tracks. They weren't boot prints. Too wide, too shallow. Almost like someone had been walking barefoot. But the toes weren't clear. The ground wasn't muddy, so they weren't obvious, but I could see where the leaf cover had been shifted. Just a few steps worth, maybe 4 or 5. They led from the tree line to about 10 feet from my tent, then turned back. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear, but bears don't move like that. And there was no sign of scratching or digging, no broken branches, no scat. Maybe a person? That didn't make sense either. Who hikes out here barefoot in the dark, walks up to someone's tent, and then leaves? I packed up my stove and decided to skip breakfast. I wanted to hike out, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I told myself I'd stay one more night, keep my hatchet closer, and sleep light. That afternoon, I stayed close to camp. I collected more wood, built the fire higher, and sharpened the blade of my hatchet with a small stone I brought. I didn't wander off at all. I kept checking the trail I'd come in on, thinking maybe I'd see someone, but it stayed empty. Right before dusk, I found something new, wedged between two rocks near the stream. A piece of cloth, maybe the size of a bandana, dirty, frayed at the edges, but looked like it might have been part of a shirt. Dark green, maybe, didn't look like it had been there long. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in my bag with the hatchet in one hand and my flashlight in the other, listening. It was dead quiet for hours. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, this time slower, more deliberate. I held my breath and waited. The steps got closer. I could hear leaves shift just outside the tent. I turned on my flashlight and pointed it at the wall of the tent. I didn't unzip it. I just held still. The steps stopped. Nothing for a full minute. Then, a soft sound, like something dragging through the leaves. Then silence. I stayed like that for maybe 30 minutes, light still on, hand gripping the hatchet so tight it hurt. No more sounds. Eventually, I killed the light and waited. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the sun came up, I packed everything. Tent, stove, sleeping bag. I didn't even eat. I checked the area again. This time I found something else. A cut, just a shallow one, in the bark of a tree near the edge of the clearing. Fresh, maybe made with a knife. It was about chest height, like someone had marked it. I didn't stick around to think about it. I started hiking out, fast and quiet. The weird part was I didn't feel safer on the trail. It was too quiet. Even birds weren't making noise. I kept looking behind me. Every bend, every fallen log, I checked. I moved faster than I should have with the full pack. My calves burned and my breath came short, but I didn't stop until I saw the car. The car was just like I left it, but the driver's side mirror was turned all the way inward, like someone had bumped it or moved it on purpose. I hadn't parked that close to any trees, so it shouldn't have been touched. I opened the back, threw my gear inside, and got in. I didn't even change out of my boots, just started the car and drove. When I hit the paved road again, I pulled over at the first gas station I found. I sat in the lot with the car idling and thought about what had happened. I didn't report anything. What would I even say? That someone walked up to my tent at night and left a scrap of shirt and a mark on a tree? That I heard footsteps and saw prints but nothing else? There wasn't any law against walking in the woods. But it wasn't just that. It was the way it all felt. Planned, measured, like someone had been watching me long before I noticed anything was wrong. I didn't go back to the woods after that. Not alone. Not even with friends. I stopped hiking trails I didn't know. I sold the Nikon. I even moved apartments a month later, not because I thought anyone followed me, but because I wanted to feel like I had put distance between myself and whatever that trip had stirred up. It wasn't ghosts or monsters or anything out of a storybook. It was just the possibility that someone out there had decided to play a game with me. A game I didn't know the rules of. One I didn't want to be part of. That was the part that stuck with me most. Not the fear, the intent. Someone was out there in those woods, and they weren't lost, and they weren't curious. They were deliberate, and I don't ever want to find out what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. I was 33 when I decided to take some time away from work. It was the summer of 2022, and I had just gone through a long and stressful project at the construction company I worked for in Indianapolis. I'd been feeling burnt out, tired all the time, snapping at people for no reason. I needed a break, and I didn't want to spend it sitting in a hotel or scrolling on my phone. I wanted something quiet, away from people and traffic, something that would reset my brain. That's when I got the idea to go camping. I used to camp a lot as a kid with my uncle. We'd head out into the woods for days at a time. No cell service, no lights, just the sound of crickets and the wind through the trees. I hadn't done that in over a decade. I figured if I could recreate even a piece of that piece, it would be worth it. So, I took a few days off, packed my gear, and drove down to the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. It wasn't too far from where I lived, about a 3-hour drive, but it felt like a whole other world once I got there. I didn't want to stay in a campground with other people around, so I researched some dispersed camping areas in the forest. One spot caught my eye, a ridge just past a place called Turkey Foot Campground. It wasn't an official site, but several hiking forums mentioned it. A flat spot near a creek, about 1.5 miles off the main trail, far enough from anything to feel isolated. That sounded perfect. I arrived on a Thursday morning. The parking lot by the trailhead was empty, which I took as a good sign. I strapped on my pack, heavy with food, water, and a good-sized tent, and set off down the trail. It was hot and humid, the kind of heat that soaks through your shirt in minutes, and the air smelled like wet leaves and pine. I walked for about 20 minutes before cutting off the trail and heading through the woods toward the ridge. The trees got denser, and I had to push branches out of my face as I moved. Eventually, the ground started sloping upward, and I knew I was getting close. It took me about an hour to reach the spot I'd seen online. It was even better than I expected. A flat patch of dirt surrounded by thick trees, a small rock fire ring, and a shallow creek running nearby. No trash, no signs of recent use. Felt untouched, like something out of a memory. I set up my tent beneath a big oak tree, rolled out my sleeping bag, and cracked open a beer I had packed in a small cooler. I felt more relaxed in those first 10 minutes than I had in weeks. The first day passed without anything unusual. I explored a bit, following the creek downstream until it narrowed and disappeared into a thicker section of the woods. I gathered some firewood, cooked up a can of chili over my little stove, and sat by the fire until it got dark. Once the sun dipped behind the trees, the woods turned quiet. Not in a creepy way, just still. The kind of silence that lets you hear your own heartbeat. I climbed into my tent around 10 and fell asleep almost instantly. The next morning, I woke up to birds chirping and a beam of sunlight cutting through the mesh of the tent. I felt good. I stretched, got out of the tent, and walked barefoot down to the creek to wash my face. The water was cold and clean, and it helped wake me up. I spent the day fishing with a line I tied to a stick and a few hooks I brought. I caught a couple of small trout, nothing big, but it was enough to grill over the fire. I ate lunch and lounged around, reading an old paperback I'd brought. It was peaceful, just like I wanted. That second night, I stayed up a bit later. I was sitting by the fire, sipping the last of my beer, when I thought I heard something moving through the woods behind me. It was faint, just a crunch of leaves, but enough to make me turn around. I couldn't see anything. The fire was bright, and my eyes had adjusted to the light, so the woods beyond looked like a black wall. I figured it was probably a raccoon or maybe a deer. I stood up, waved my flashlight around the trees, and didn't see anything. I wasn't scared, just alert. That's part of camping, after all. The woods are full of animals. I went to bed a little later than the night before, but I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up, listening for noises. A few times I thought I heard something. Maybe footsteps, maybe just my imagination, but every time I got up and checked, nothing was there. I figured my brain was just on high alert from being out there alone. That happens sometimes. Your mind plays tricks on you. The third day was hotter. I spent most of it in the shade, reading and dozing off. I felt a bit more on edge, though. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything specific, just a low-level tension that sat in my chest. I started noticing little things. A small pile of rocks near the creek that I didn't remember seeing before. A stick leaned up against a tree like someone had placed it there. A patch of moss that looked disturbed. I kept telling myself I was just overthinking it, seeing patterns where there weren't any. That night, I decided not to make a fire. I didn't want to attract animals or people for that matter. I sat in my tent, listening. It was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel peaceful. Felt watched. Around midnight, I heard it. Definite footsteps, not animals. Slow, deliberate stepping on dry leaves. I held my breath and listened, heart pounding. The steps were circling my tent, soft but steady. Then they stopped. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there, clutching the handle of my knife, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe longer. Eventually, I heard the steps again, moving away into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just waited for the sun to rise. When morning came, I got out of the tent and looked around. Nothing seemed touched. No signs of anyone. But the feeling was still there, and I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I packed up everything, stuffing my gear as fast as I could. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting someone to step out of the trees. No one did. The hike back to the trail was nerve-wracking. Every sound made me flinch. Every gust of wind through the leaves made me stop and listen. I felt exposed out there, alone with nothing but trees and silence. When I finally made it back to the main trail, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I followed it back to the parking lot and found my car untouched, just as I'd left it. I drove straight home. I didn't stop until I pulled into my driveway. I unloaded my gear, took a long shower, and collapsed onto the couch. I didn't sleep that night either. My head was spinning. What had I heard? Who had been out there? Why didn't they say anything or make themselves known? A few days later, I started doing some digging. I looked up reports of people camping in that area, trying to find anything similar. I came across a forum post from a guy who said he camped in the same forest a year earlier, not far from where I'd been. He described hearing footsteps around his tent at night and finding small piles of rocks nearby that hadn't been there before. He left early too. He didn't see anyone, but he was sure someone had been watching him. I don't know who it was or what they wanted. Maybe it was just someone messing around. Maybe it was a squatter or some backwoods loner who didn't like people in their area. Or maybe it was something worse. I don't think I'll ever know. What I do know is that I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. I still love the woods, and I still believe in getting away from the noise of everyday life. But there's a difference between solitude and isolation. When you're out there alone, miles from help, no phone signal, no other people for hours in any direction, you're vulnerable in a way that's hard to describe. You realize how easy it would be for someone to watch you without being seen. How simple it would be for someone to move through the trees, just outside your vision, and you'd never know. I was lucky. Whoever was out there didn't try to hurt me. Maybe they were just curious, or maybe they were waiting to see how long I'd stay. Maybe I left just in time. Either way, that trip changed something in me. I still go hiking. I still love the forest. But I never stay out overnight alone anymore. Not after that. Some places feel wrong for a reason, and when your gut tells you to leave, you listen. That instinct, that ancient feeling that something is watching you. It's there for a reason, and next time I won't ignore it. I was 32 the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip through the Bitterroot National Forest in western Montana. It was 2022, early August, and the weather had been steady for weeks. Hot days, cool nights, mostly dry. I had been working in a warehouse job in Spokane for 3 straight years without a real vacation. The repetitive noise, the fluorescent lights, the smell of cardboard and sweat. It had all been wearing on me. I needed something different. I'd always loved the outdoors, and I figured a solo trip would reset my mind. I spent the week before planning it out. I wasn't going deep into the backcountry, just enough to feel isolated without being stupid. I mapped out a loop trail, 30 miles over 3 nights, starting at a small trailhead south of Darby. I stocked my pack with food, water purification tablets, a tent, a first aid kit, bear spray, and some light gear. I brought a basic satellite communicator too, just in case. No cell signal in that part of Montana. I got to the trailhead around 2 p.m. on a Thursday, parked my car under some trees, and locked it up. There was only one other car there, a dusty old blue Toyota Corolla with Idaho plates. No people in sight. I hoisted my pack, clicked the chest strap, and started walking. The trail wound up through pines and thick brush, and it felt good to move. The air smelled like sun-warmed sap and dry grass. I passed a couple of creek beds that had mostly dried up, some patches of loose rock, and one steep ridge where I stopped to rest and drink. Everything felt right, calm, clean. That night, I pitched my tent in a clearing surrounded by spruce trees. I had a small fire for warmth and cooked one of those dehydrated meals, chili mac, I think. I listened to the wind stirring in the trees and the soft clatter of insects. There were some distant animal sounds, nothing unusual. Probably a deer or a porcupine rooting around. I wasn't worried. I knew the rules. Keep food sealed, stay alert, no sudden moves if you see a bear. I slept fine, but I woke up around 4 a.m. to a sound. Not loud, but different. Something light, like a branch breaking or leaves shifting. I stayed still for a while, listening. My tent was zipped up tight, and I didn't hear anything else after that. Maybe something passed by. A raccoon, maybe. I drifted off again. The next day, I hiked about 10 more miles. The trail dipped through a valley and climbed back up a ridge that had a perfect view of the mountains in the distance. I took some photos, but mostly I just watched. I stopped around 6 p.m. near a small alpine lake, set up my tent again, and took a quick swim in the freezing water before eating dinner. There were no signs of people. No rappers, no old fire rings, nothing. Just untouched forest. That night, I woke again, around 3 a.m. This time it was louder. Not animals, not the wind. I stayed still and listened. It sounded like a zipper. Maybe not mine, but close. Then it stopped. A minute later, I heard something crunch outside the tent, like someone stepping on dried needles and twigs. Then nothing. I reached quietly for the bear spray. I didn't say anything. I didn't even breathe heavily. I just lay there. I didn't fall back asleep for a long time. At some point, the sound stopped completely. The next morning, I checked around my campsite. Nothing looked touched. My food bag was still hanging in the tree. No tracks, no markings, no moved gear. I told myself maybe it had been a large animal, an elk maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been deliberate. Too quiet, too close. I debated turning back, but I was already halfway through the loop. The fastest way out was forward. I hiked slow that day, constantly checking the trail behind me. I didn't see anyone, not a single other hiker. The forest started to feel different. Not dangerous exactly, just off, like someone was watching me. I kept scanning the trees, looking for movement. I stopped more often, listening. I didn't enjoy it anymore. The quiet wasn't peaceful now. It was suffocating. I made camp in a narrow valley surrounded by thick timber. There wasn't a great view of the sky, and the trees closed in fast. I didn't make a fire. I wanted to stay low. I didn't cook dinner either, just ate a protein bar and kept my gear close. When it got dark, I stayed in the tent, bear spray right next to my sleeping bag. I tried reading a paperback I brought, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound outside felt important. At around 11 p.m., I heard it again. This time it was closer, a definite footstep, not a heavy stomp, but slow, intentional. Then another. I sat up, heart hammering, and held my breath. There was no wind, no animal noises, just footsteps, then silence. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard the sound of something brushing against my tent. Not clawing, just a slight, dragging touch across the nylon wall. Then a pause, then another touch. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there holding the bear spray, staring at the tent wall. It went on like that for what felt like hours. Eventually, everything went quiet. No more steps, no brushing, just complete stillness. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake until first light, when the birds started up and the air got brighter. I waited until the sun had cleared the tops of the trees before I unzipped the tent. My limbs were stiff from staying still for so long. I scanned the area carefully. No one was there, no signs of movement. But about 10 feet from the tent, I found something that made my stomach turn. A boot print. It was clear in the soft dirt. Human, not mine. Too small. Someone else had been there. No tread pattern I recognized. Just a flat sole with a worn edge. I looked around the area and found another, slightly deeper one behind a tree. That was it. I packed up in 15 minutes and didn't eat. I just walked, fast, I didn't even stop for water until I was out of that valley and halfway up the next ridge. The trees thinned, and I started seeing signs of other hikers. Some old fire pits, a few beer cans, a cigarette butt. Civilization. The tension didn't leave, though. I still felt like someone was behind me. I kept checking. By 4 p.m., I reached the last site I planned to camp at. It was right next to a wide creek. Open space. Good visibility. I thought about staying, but I couldn't. I didn't want another night out there, so I kept going. The last 5 miles were brutal. Legs sore, feet blistered, back soaked with sweat. But I did it. I got back to the trailhead just after sunset. When I reached my car, I noticed something immediately. The blue Corolla was gone, but there were fresh tire tracks in the dirt next to mine. They weren't there when I arrived. The ground was soft enough that I could tell the pattern was new. Someone had parked there while I was gone. Maybe just another hiker, but maybe not. I checked my car. Doors locked, windows up, nothing stolen or moved. I got in and drove straight back to Spokane, not stopping for food or anything. I just wanted to be around people again. I wanted light, noise, traffic. I didn't care. Back home, I didn't sleep well for days. I kept the blinds shut and double-checked the locks. The sound of my tent being touched, the boot prints, the quiet breathing outside, they stayed with me. 2 weeks later, I was scrolling through local news and saw a headline that stopped me cold. Hiker found dead in Bitterroot forest. The article said the body had been found about 10 miles north of where I camped my second night. They didn't say the cause of death, just that it was a man in his 40s and that foul play hadn't been ruled out. He'd been missing for almost a week before someone stumbled on him. No name was released, no suspect mentioned, just that the body had been found near a rarely used trail off the Maine loop. Rangers warned hikers to use caution and not camp alone. I kept reading the article over and over, thinking about the footsteps, the tent brushing, the boot prints, the Corolla, that quiet feeling of being watched. I don't know if the person who died was connected to what happened to me, but I know I wasn't alone out there. I haven't gone camping since. Not alone, not with friends. I sold most of my gear a few months later. I still hike sometimes, but only on busy trails. Only in daylight. I used to love that deep quiet you get in the woods. Now it just reminds me of how silence can hide anything. That trip was supposed to clear my mind, but it did the opposite. It reminded me that danger doesn't need to shout or snarl or drag chains. Sometimes it just stands close, waits until it's dark, and brushes a finger across your tent wall, slow and patient, while you sit there too scared to breathe. It's late October, just a week or so before Halloween. The air is crisp, a hint of winter's coldness in every breeze. I'm out in the woods of northern Michigan, camping alone. I've always been the type to take these trips on my own, just me and the wilderness. No real destination, just the thrill of hiking through thick trees, breathing in that earthy smell of pine and leaves. It's a familiar feeling, but something about this trip feels different. I'm 32, a city guy through and through, but there's something peaceful about the solitude of the forest that pulls me back every year. I don't tell many people where I'm going. It's not like I'm ashamed of it, I just don't want to hear the usual complaints. It's dangerous, they say. You shouldn't go alone. But I've been doing this for years. I know how to take care of myself. The sun sets early this time of year, so by the time I get to my campsite, the light is fading fast. I'm just outside a small national park, near a stream that's known to have a decent fishing spot. The spot I've chosen is a little off the beaten path, but nothing too far from the trail. I've been here a few times before. It's quiet, peaceful. Setting up the tent goes quickly. I've done this 1,000 times before. A simple 2-person tent, nothing fancy. I don't need luxury when I'm out here, just a sleeping bag and a few essentials. I gather some firewood, build up a little fire pit, and get a fire started. The flames crackle, sending a warm glow into the growing darkness. The only sound around me is the soft rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird or animal. It's peaceful, Too peaceful, maybe. I pull out a can of beans and some crackers, eating slowly by the fire. The light flickers, shadows shifting in the trees. I glance over my shoulder, noticing the way the forest seems to close in around me, the trees pressing in like silent watchers. I brush off the thought, reminding myself that it's just my imagination. Night fully settles in. I sit by the fire for a while, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. It's subtle at first, like someone or something is just beyond the edge of the light, hiding in the darkness. I tell myself it's nothing. I've been out here plenty of times and nothing has ever happened. But that nagging feeling doesn't go away. I poke the fire with a stick, watching the sparks fly up into the night sky. The warmth is nice, but the air feels colder now. I zip up my jacket, even though it's not that cold. It's just a feeling. The trees sway gently, but there's something off about the way they move. The rustling doesn't sound natural, and the shadows in the forest seem to stretch longer than they should. Around 9 p.m., I hear something. It's faint at first, but I catch it. A snap of a twig in the distance. I freeze, listening intently. It's hard to say for sure, but it almost sounds like footsteps. Slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. My heart skips a beat. Could be another camper, but no one else is supposed to be around here. This area is pretty remote, and I haven't passed any other hikers since I left the Maine trail hours ago. I sit in silence, straining to hear more. The footsteps stop. I listen, trying to hear the wind or the rustling of the trees, but everything is still, too still. Then, just as suddenly, the footsteps resume, this time closer, more distinct. There's no wind now to explain the noise. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I can't see anything beyond the firelight, but I know someone or something is out there. I grab my flashlight, my hands shaking slightly as I turn it on. The beam cuts through the darkness, but it only illuminates a few feet in front of me. The forest beyond the circle of light is just a black void. The footsteps stop again, but this time they don't resume. Instead, there's a low, almost inaudible rustling, like something is moving slowly through the trees, just out of sight. My pulse quickens. The fire crackles loudly, but the rest of the world feels like it's holding its breath. I'm not sure what I'm waiting for, but the silence is deafening. I try to convince myself it's just a deer or some other animal, but it doesn't feel like that. This feels too deliberate, too purposeful. I stand up slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fire. There's nothing, no movement, no sound, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I'm about to sit back down when I hear it again. A soft thump, followed by a quiet drag, like something heavy is being pulled along the ground. My heart races. This isn't normal. I slowly turn my head, looking over my shoulder, but there's nothing there. The woods are still. I start to second guess myself. Maybe it's just an animal. Maybe I'm just being paranoid. But the hairs on my neck are standing straight up, and my gut is telling me this isn't right. The thump sounds again, and this time it's unmistakable. It's coming from the direction of the trees on the other side of the campsite. My breath catches in my throat. I don't know what it is, but I can feel it. It's too deliberate, too human-like to be an animal. I grab my backpack and my water bottle, deciding I need to get out of here. I don't know what's out there, but I don't want to find out. I quickly pack up what I can, moving in a daze, my flashlight scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The rustling in the trees intensifies, like something is circling around me. I glance back at the tent. Should I leave it behind? Should I just run? But then I hear the sound again. Clearer now, closer, almost right behind me. It's not footsteps this time. It's a scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across bark, slow and deliberate. My heart pounds in my chest. I turn quickly, but there's nothing, just darkness. The sound stops, and the air is so still I can hear my own breathing. I stand frozen for a long moment, trying to convince myself that it's nothing. It has to be nothing. I grab my knife from my bag. Maybe it's stupid, but I feel like I need something, anything to protect myself. The fire's light flickers, casting long shadows across the campsite. I move toward the edge of the fire's reach, my eyes darting between the trees. That's when I see it. Just on the edge of the light, I spot a figure. It's tall, too tall for any person I've ever seen. The figure is standing perfectly still, blending in with the trees behind it. I freeze, staring at it, my heart in my throat. The figure doesn't move. It just watches me. For a long time, I stand there, unsure of what to do. The figure doesn't react. It doesn't even seem to breathe. But I can feel it, there's something off about it. I don't know if it's a person or something else, but I can't take my eyes off of it. I can't make myself move, but I know I need to leave. Finally, after what feels like hours, I gather the courage to break my stare. I turn and run. I don't know what's out there, but I can't stay another minute. I don't care about the tent, about the fire. All I care about is getting out. I sprint through the woods, not caring about the branches that scrape across my face or the rocks that trip me up. I just need to get to the trail to get back to civilization. I don't look behind me. I don't stop to catch my breath. I just run. It feels like forever, but eventually, I make it to the trail. I'm gasping for air, my legs burning, but I don't stop. I don't look back. I keep moving faster now toward the road. I don't care if I have to walk all the way back to town. I just need to get away from whatever was out there. By the time I reach the main road, it's well past midnight. My heart is still racing, and my legs are shaking. But I'm safe. Whatever it was, it didn't follow me. I don't know if it was a person or something else, but I don't want to know. I never went back to that spot. I don't think I ever will. Maybe it was just a strange experience, something my mind cooked up out of fear. But deep down, I don't think so. Something was out there in those woods, and it wasn't anything good. The whole trip, the whole experience, stays with me, hanging in the back of my mind. But at least I made it out, and that's all that matters. I was 31 when I decided to go on that camping trip. It was early October 2017. The air had just started to cool down in northern Idaho, and the trees were turning all shades of orange and red. I'd been working long hours at the auto shop in Coeur d'Alene for months, and I needed a break. Nothing fancy, just a quiet weekend with no traffic, no phones, and no people. I picked a spot in the Panhandle National Forest, far enough out that there wouldn't be many other campers, but still reachable by my old Toyota pickup without needing four-wheel drive. I packed light, just a basic tent, sleeping bag, cooler with enough food for 3 days, my camp stove, a few tools, and my .22 rifle just in case I ran into anything wild. I brought one of those old crank radios too, mainly for weather updates. I didn't plan on hiking much. I just wanted to sit by the fire, sleep in, maybe fish a little. The site I picked was near a small lake called Moosebell. Not a big one, just a little patch of water surrounded by pine trees and a few rough paths. The first 2 hours of driving were easy. Highway 95 was clear, and the sky was wide and blue. Once I turned off onto the forest roads, it was all dirt and gravel. I drove another hour into the woods, deeper than I'd ever gone before, until I found the spot. It wasn't an official campground. It was just a flat, open patch near the edge of the lake, maybe 50 feet from the water. The area looked like it hadn't been used much. The fire ring was half buried in pine needles, and I didn't see any signs of recent campers. That's exactly what I wanted. I parked the truck facing out, just in case I needed to leave quick. That's something my uncle taught me years ago, when I was a teenager and he used to take me hunting. Always keep the truck pointing toward the road. I set up my tent a few feet from the fire ring, unpacked the cooler and gear, and started gathering wood. There was plenty of dry stuff on the ground. By the time the sun was dipping low, I had a good fire going and a pot of beans heating up. That first night was quiet. Too quiet, maybe. No bugs, no owls, not even the wind in the trees. Just the crackle of the fire and the occasional plop of a fish jumping in the lake. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just glad to be away from the noise of town. After eating, I sat there a while, watching the flames and sipping some whiskey I brought in a flask. The air got cold quick, and I crawled into my sleeping bag before 10. I woke up once in the night, It must have been around 3, judging by the moonlight. I wasn't sure what woke me. I didn't hear anything at first, but I had that weird feeling, like someone was watching. I stayed still and listened hard. After a while, I heard something out in the trees. It wasn't close, but it was moving. Slow steps on dry pine needles. Not fast like a deer running, more like a person walking. I reached for my rifle and held it across my chest. I didn't call out or make any noise. I just lay there, frozen. The steps stopped eventually. I never saw anything. I stayed awake a long time, listening. Nothing else happened. When the sky started getting light, I finally dozed off again. The next morning, everything looked normal. I walked around the site a bit, checked the ground. No prints. Maybe it was just a raccoon or something. I tried not to let it bother me. I made coffee on the stove and watched the mist rise off the lake. I spent the rest of the morning fishing from the bank. Didn't catch anything worth keeping, but it kept me busy. By afternoon, the clouds had rolled in, and the temperature dropped a bit. Around 4 or so, I heard something weird. It was like a single, distant thump. Not a gunshot, more like a heavy object hitting the ground. I stood up and looked around, but the forest was still. The sound didn't come again. I walked a little way up the hill behind my tent to get a better view. Nothing, just trees. I told myself it was probably a branch falling. Those happen all the time, especially with the wind picking up. That night, I built a bigger fire. I didn't like the silence. The woods felt different. I can't really explain it. Just off. I kept my rifle within arm's reach. I ate, drank a little, and tried to relax, but my ears were always tuned in, listening. After the sky went dark, I heard the footsteps again, this time closer. Same pattern, slow, one at a time. Crunch, pause, crunch. I turned off my lantern and sat in the dark, staring out toward the trees. The fire was low, but it threw enough light that I could see the edge of the clearing. The sound came from behind the tent this time. Then it stopped. No movement. I waited, heart pounding in my chest. Still nothing. After a long time, I stood up and moved around the fire to see better. I didn't shout. I didn't want to give away my exact position. My hand was tight on the rifle. I kept staring into the woods, but the darkness swallowed everything. Nothing moved. Eventually, I went back to the tent and waited. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I was done pretending it was all in my head. Something was out there. Maybe someone. I packed my gear as fast as I could and loaded it into the truck. I planned to be out before noon, but when I turned the key, the engine didn't start. Just clicked. Battery was fine, lights worked, but the starter wasn't catching. I popped the hood and checked everything I could think of. The starter motor wires were cut. Not frayed. Clean cut. That's when I felt it in my gut. I wasn't alone out there. I kept my rifle in my hand after that. Every noise made me jump. I checked my phone, but of course, no signal. I grabbed the crank radio and listened, hoping maybe I'd catch a weather report or even a ranger broadcast. Nothing useful. I had a choice. Stay another night and wait for someone to come by, or start walking. The nearest main road was probably 12 or 13 miles away. I had good boots and plenty of water. I made a quick pack with food, flashlight, knife, the radio, and set off. I didn't take the path I came in on. I didn't want to walk down the same road where whoever or whatever had cut the wires might be waiting. I figured I could bushwhack east until I hit a logging road I remembered passing on the way in. If I followed it south, it would meet the main road eventually. The woods felt wrong. I kept turning around, thinking I heard movement behind me. A stick snap, a breath, the sound of something brushing against bark. But every time I looked, nothing was there. I walked fast but tried to stay quiet. I didn't want to attract attention, but I didn't want to be out there after dark either. After about 3 hours, I found something that made my stomach turn. It was an old campsite, not mine, a different one. A faded tarp, broken poles, empty cans, torn clothing. No tent, no backpack, just a mess. The site looked like it had been there a while. Everything was damp and moldy, but there was something else. On the tree nearest the tarp, someone had carved something into the bark. Deep letters. Go back. That was enough for me. I picked up my pace. My legs started to ache. The woods were thick, and I had to keep changing direction to get around deadfall and brush. I kept checking the compass on my watch. East, always east. I drank water in short sips, kept my rifle close. The sun was already dipping by the time I found the logging road. It was nothing more than 2 worn tracks in the grass, but it was a relief. I followed it south, fast as I could. Still no cell signal. I kept walking even after it got dark, using my flashlight and listening hard between steps. Around 8, I stopped to rest. I sat on a rock, eating jerky, breathing heavy. That's when I saw the light. A small, flickering light, deep in the trees to the west. Firelight. I turned off my flashlight quick and crouched. The light didn't move. It just sat there, steady. Whoever it was, they were camping too. Maybe it was just a hunter. But after everything I'd seen, I didn't trust that. I waited, hidden, watching the glow. After 10 minutes, it faded out. I kept moving after that. My feet hurt. My back was killing me. But I didn't stop again. Around 2 in the morning, I finally saw headlights. A truck parked at the end of the logging road near a gate. I waved my flashlight like crazy. The driver was a Forest Service guy doing patrol. I must have looked like a mess. Muddy, tired, carrying a rifle, but he let me in the cab and called it in. At the ranger station, they checked my ID, took my statement. When I told them about the cut wires, the footsteps, the other campsite, they looked serious. One of them, a younger guy, said that a few hikers had gone missing in that area over the past 10 years. Nothing ever proven, but locals avoided that part of the forest. Too many weird stories. They sent a crew to recover my truck. When they brought it back, they confirmed the wires were cut with a blade. No animal could have done that. They asked if I wanted to file a report with the sheriff. I did. Nothing came of it. They never found anyone. After that, I didn't go camping alone again. I still go out sometimes, but always with someone else and never off the marked trails. I've got motion sensors. It was the summer of 2018, and I was 32 at the time. I lived in Helena, Montana, and had gotten into the habit of taking long solo camping trips during the warmer months. I worked remotely doing freelance GIS mapping jobs, so I had the freedom to take off whenever I wanted, as long as I met deadlines. That summer had been busier than usual, and by late July, I'd had enough of my screen and my apartment. I decided I'd head out to a spot I hadn't been before, up near the northern border of Idaho, about 2 hours west of Libby, close to the Yaak River. It was forested, remote, with minimal traffic and almost no cell reception. That was part of what drew me in. I wanted quiet, maybe even some discomfort, to shake me out of my mental slump. I loaded up my gear in the back of my 2009 Tacoma: tent, sleeping bag, bear canister, food, propane stove, water filter, clothes, tarp, and some basic tools. I had a GPS unit and topo maps. I always packed with care. I'd had enough experience to know that the forest doesn't care about you, and mistakes add up fast when you're on your own. I didn't tell many people where I was going. That was probably my first mistake. The drive out was long but peaceful. Once I got west of Libby and off the main highways, the roads turned to gravel, and I didn't see another car for close to an hour. There were no big trail signs, no ranger stations, and definitely no campgrounds. Just dirt roads, dense pine, and a few old logging clearings. I ended up parking at the end of a rutted-out forest road that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I packed up my gear and hiked in about 1.5 miles, following a game trail that ran along a small creek. I picked a flat patch of ground under a thick stand of trees, far enough from the creek to avoid bugs but close enough for water. The forest around me was quiet, thick with moss and old pine needles. I saw elk scat, a few squirrel nests, but nothing fresh or concerning. Felt right. The first night went smoothly. I made camp, got a small fire going, cooked a bit of rice and sausage, and turned in early. The sound of the creek mixed with the wind in the trees made for good sleep. The second day, I did a little exploring. I took a bearing westward and bushwhacked about 1 mile out to get a better feel for the terrain. It was rugged, hilly, and thick with undergrowth. I didn't see or hear another person the entire day. I felt completely alone out there, and I liked it. That night, I ate early and went to bed before dark. It got cold fast, and I had no interest in sitting out there in the dark. On the third morning, I woke up around 6. Something felt off right away. Not in a dramatic way, but enough to notice. The forest was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. The birds that had been active around my camp the previous mornings weren't there. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I figured maybe a predator had moved through the area, a bobcat or a black bear, and the birds were just keeping their distance. Still, I kept alert. After breakfast, I walked down to the creek to fill my water bottles. That's when I noticed the footprints. Human. They were on the muddy bank just upstream from where I normally got my water. I crouched down and looked closer. The prints were fairly fresh, maybe made that morning or late the night before. The tread pattern was distinct, not from any boot I recognized. Smaller than mine, but not by much. I stood there for a while just staring at them, trying to make sense of it. No one should have been out here. The road I drove in on was nearly overgrown, and I hadn't passed a single vehicle or sign of human activity since turning off the main road. I hadn't heard voices, seen lights, or smelled smoke from other fires. I told myself maybe it was just another hiker, someone as off-grid as I was, but it didn't sit right. My camp was hidden from the creek, tucked into a dip in the terrain, and I hadn't made any effort to mark it visibly. Someone would have had to stumble right into it to know I was there. I decided to stay calm, but I made a note to be more cautious. I packed up most of my gear that morning and kept it in my pack, in case I needed to leave fast. That afternoon, I didn't go far. I stayed within earshot of camp and kept watch from a ridge above. I figured if someone was out there, maybe they'd show themselves or maybe they'd move on. Nothing happened for hours. The sun started to go down, and I moved back into camp just before dark. I made no fire, ate a cold meal, and listened. The silence was still there. No crickets, no birds, just wind. That night, sleep came in short stretches. I kept waking up, heart pounding, ears tuned to every snap of a twig or brush of wind against the tent. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. Not an animal. It was the unmistakable crunch of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving through the underbrush uphill from my tent. They stopped for a while, then started again. It was hard to tell exactly how far away they were, but it was close enough to make my skin crawl. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I just lay there, hand on my knife, barely breathing. The steps eventually faded, but I didn't sleep after that. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. I wasn't going to stick around and hope this person was just another camper. I packed fast, not even bothering to cook breakfast. Everything went back into my bag. I broke down the tent and hiked out fast, constantly checking behind me. The woods stayed silent the whole time, like they were watching. When I got back to my truck, I stopped cold. Someone had been there. The dirt around the truck showed tracks. More of those same treads from the creek bank. My driver's side mirror had been pushed inward, and there were smudges on the windows. No damage, nothing missing that I could see, but it was clear someone had been poking around. I checked the undercarriage and the tires. No signs of tampering, but I couldn't be sure. I got in and started the engine. Turned over fine. I didn't waste time. I drove out fast, barely slowing on the rough sections of road. When I hit pavement again, I didn't stop until I was back in Libby. Back at a cheap motel off the highway, I did a full inventory of my gear. Nothing missing. I cleaned up, showered, and finally let myself relax a little. But the feeling didn't go away. I couldn't shake the sense that I'd been watched, followed, even hunted. It was more than just being creeped out, it was instinct. Something in me had known, even before I saw the prints, that something was wrong out there. I reported the incident to the local sheriff's office, just to put it on record. They didn't seem too concerned. They said it was probably just another camper or a squatter. Maybe it was, but I've done a lot of solo trips in my life. I know the difference between feeling alone and being watched. Whoever was out there, they had no interest in being found. They didn't steal anything. They didn't try to make contact. They just hovered around my camp, moved through the forest quietly, and left almost no trace. I haven't been back to that part of the state since. I still camp, still go solo, but I stay closer to areas with ranger stations or some kind of traffic. That trip changed how I approach the wilderness. It reminded me that sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't a bear or a storm. It's another person, someone you never see but who sees you. And the worst part is, I'll never know what they wanted. Maybe they were just curious. Maybe they were looking for something. Or maybe they were waiting for me to make a mistake. Either way, I was lucky. I left before anything happened. And that was the last time I treated the woods like they were just empty space. Because sometimes they aren't. The woods are quiet. Too quiet. It's the kind of silence that makes you wonder if something is out there, lurking just out of sight. But I don't mind the quiet. In fact, I like it. It's one of the reasons I've been coming here for years. There's something peaceful about the isolation, about being surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of your own thoughts. It's a break from the chaos of everyday life. I pull the straps of my backpack tighter as I trudge along the dirt trail. The sun is setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the path. I've been walking for a couple of hours, and the air is starting to cool. I can feel the weight of the pack on my shoulders, but it's manageable. The hike has been easy so far, mostly flat terrain with the occasional uphill stretch. I've hiked in tougher conditions, but the solitude of this place makes it feel different. I'm headed to a campsite I found on a map a few weeks ago, tucked deep in the woods near the edge of a lake. It's a secluded spot, which is exactly what I want. I'm 29, alone, and looking for some time away from everything. Away from the noise, the people, the responsibilities. Just me, the trees, and the lake. No distractions, no obligations. Just peace. As the sun continues to dip lower in the sky, I quicken my pace. The last thing I want is to be setting up camp in the dark. The trail gets a bit narrower here, and the trees seem to close in around me, their branches reaching out like fingers. The forest smells fresh, damp, the earthy scent of pine and wet soil mixing in the cool air. I pass a few large rocks, their surfaces worn smooth by years of rain, and a trickling creek that runs alongside the path. I keep moving, the rhythmic sound of my boots hitting the ground the only noise. After another hour, I see it, the clearing ahead, where the campsite is supposed to be. My legs are sore from the long hike, but I can see the water now, sparkling under the last light of the day. I smile, relieved to have made it. The campsite is just as I remember from the map. A small, flat patch of land near the water, surrounded by tall pines. There's a fire ring in the middle of the clearing, its stones covered in a layer of moss. I set down my pack and stretch, feeling the tension leave my body. The lake looks calm, the surface like glass, reflecting the fading colors of the sunset. I can't wait to set up my tent and just relax for the night. I pull out my tent and start setting it up, the familiar motions comforting after so many trips. The poles snap into place with ease, and the fabric of the tent stretches taut against the wind. The fire ring is close by, so I gather some dry wood from around the clearing and start building a small fire. I don't plan to make it too big, just enough to keep the chill off and add to the ambience. The fire crackles to life as I strike a match, the scent of burning wood mixing with the fresh air. With the tent set up and the fire going, I sit down on a log near the fire and take a deep breath, letting the peace of the place wash over me. The sky has darkened completely now, and the stars are beginning to appear, their faint light reflecting off the surface of the lake. The only sounds are the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant rustle of the trees. I eat some jerky and a granola bar, not really hungry but needing something in my stomach. I've never been much of a cook when I'm camping. The simplicity of it all is part of the appeal, just a few basic supplies and the open wilderness. There's something freeing about not having to worry about much. As the night deepens, the temperature drops. I add a few more logs to the fire and pull my jacket tighter around me. The flames flicker in the wind, casting strange, dancing shadows around the clearing. I can't help but notice that the forest feels a little off. It's not anything specific, just a feeling that something is different. The quiet is deeper now, almost unnatural, and I find myself straining to listen for anything, any sign that I'm not alone. But there's nothing, just the fire crackling and the occasional rustle of the trees in the wind. I shake it off, telling myself it's just the isolation getting to me. I've camped here before, and nothing bad has ever happened. This is my place, my spot. I crawl into the tent, zip it up, and settle into my sleeping bag. The fabric rustles around me, and I close my eyes, the exhaustion of the hike pulling me under. But sleep doesn't come easily tonight. The sounds of the forest are different, too sharp, too constant. The wind seems to be picking up, and I can hear something else now, something moving in the trees. I try to tell myself it's just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the sound doesn't feel right. It's too deliberate, too heavy. A rustle followed by a snap of a branch. I hold my breath, waiting, but nothing else happens. The night goes still again. Minutes pass, or maybe it's hours. I'm not sure. My mind starts to play tricks on me, imagining all kinds of scenarios. I tell myself I'm being stupid, that there's nothing out there, just the forest doing its thing. But then I hear it again, a snap, and then the unmistakable sound of someone walking through the underbrush. I sit up, heart pounding in my chest. The sound is closer now, not far from the edge of the clearing. My hand reaches for the flashlight by my side, my fingers trembling as I grip it. I don't know what I'm expecting to find, but the fear of the unknown is choking me, filling my throat like a stone. I wait, every muscle in my body tight with tension. I shine the flashlight toward the sound, but there's nothing there, just trees, empty, dark trees. I'm starting to doubt myself, to wonder if I'm just imagining things. I listen closely, straining to hear any movement. And then, just as I'm about to relax, I hear it again, louder this time, right on the edge of the clearing. The unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the dry leaves and twigs. My stomach drops. I turn the flashlight off, staying perfectly still in the darkness. My breath is shallow, my mind racing. Who's out there? There shouldn't be anyone out here. This campsite is miles from the nearest trail. No one else knows I'm here. I can feel my pulse in my ears, each beat louder than the last. I force myself to be quiet, listening for any hint of movement. The footsteps stop. For a long moment, there's nothing. The night air feels thicker, colder. I strain my ears, but all I can hear is the sound of my own breathing. I don't know what to do. I can't just sit here and wait forever, but I also don't want to go out there. Eventually, I gather the courage to unzip the tent slightly, just enough to peek out. The light of the fire flickers in the distance, casting long shadows across the clearing. I scan the area, my eyes darting back and forth, but I don't see anything. I slip out of the tent quietly, keeping low. My eyes are still adjusting to the dark, and I move slowly, quietly. Every step feels like it could betray me, like the smallest sound could give me away. I circle the clearing, scanning the tree line. The fire is still burning, its embers glowing softly, but there's no sign of anyone, no movement, just the wind, the trees, the distant sound of water lapping against the shore. I keep moving, walking the perimeter of the camp, checking every corner. After a while, I start to relax. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe I've just been too paranoid. The forest plays tricks on your mind in the dark. I stand there for a moment, the fire crackling behind me, and I feel foolish. No one was out there. It was just my imagination. I return to the tent, zip it up, and settle back into my sleeping bag. This time, sleep comes quickly. The fear of earlier fades, replaced by a deep sense of exhaustion. The sounds of the forest outside continue, but I block them out, letting myself drift off into a peaceful sleep. The next morning, I wake to the sound of birdsong. The sunlight filters through the trees, casting a warm, golden light across the campsite. The fire is just a pile of ashes now, and the world feels calm again. I pack up my gear, feeling lighter, more at ease. The fear of last night seems like a distant memory now. Maybe I was just imagining things, or maybe it was an animal. Either way, I'm ready to head home. The woods are beautiful, but I think I've had enough for this trip. As I make my way back down the trail, I can't help but glance over my shoulder once or twice, just to make sure. But the forest is still. It's just the trees, the dirt, and the path ahead of me. And for the first time in hours, I feel truly at peace. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, a chance to escape the noise of the city and spend some time in nature. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. My friends and I had rented a small cabin at a campsite in the middle of nowhere, somewhere deep in the northern part of Michigan. The air was crisp, the pine trees towered overhead, and the sound of the nearby river was a constant, soothing hum. We had everything we needed for a relaxing trip: tents, sleeping bags, a fire pit, and enough food and drinks to last us for days. There were just 3 of us, myself, my buddy Kevin, and his girlfriend, Sarah. We had known each other for years, and our weekends were often spent on trips like these. I was 29, Kevin was 31, and Sarah was 27. We all worked from home, and that meant long stretches of isolation. So when a weekend came up, we were always eager to escape our small apartments and recharge in the outdoors. The first day was everything we had hoped for. We set up camp near the cabin, gathered wood for a fire, and spent the afternoon hiking through the woods. The weather was perfect, bright and sunny with just a hint of chill in the air, perfect for walking without breaking a sweat. We had some snacks, shared a few stories, and joked about everything and nothing. Felt like we had the whole world to ourselves. But as the sun began to dip behind the trees, things started to feel a little off. Nothing major, just a strange sense of unease that crept in. At first, I thought it was just the darkening of the forest and the change in atmosphere. The chirping of birds slowly faded, and the air became still, too still. Kevin and Sarah didn't seem to notice, but I felt it. That evening, as we sat around the fire, the shadows of the trees seemed to grow longer, more defined. The fire crackled, and Sarah leaned into Kevin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it wouldn't go away. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot sent a jolt through my body. We stayed up late, talking and laughing, but eventually, we all turned in for the night. The cabin was a bit small and a little run down, but it was comfortable enough. We each took a room, and as soon as I laid down in bed, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't the usual discomfort you get in a new place. No, this was different. There was something else in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside my window. They were slow, deliberate steps, too heavy to be an animal, too human to be a deer or any other wildlife. My heart raced, and I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to stop. But it didn't. The steps continued. First, they were to the left of the cabin, then to the right, back and forth like someone pacing. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to look out the window, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the more I listened, the more real it felt. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Complete silence. I eventually managed to drift off to sleep, but the next morning, the unease lingered. Kevin and Sarah didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary, and I didn't want to ruin the trip by sharing my thoughts, so I kept quiet. We spent the next day hiking to a nearby lake, and although the beauty of the area was breathtaking, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that we weren't alone. That night, we decided to sleep outside by the campfire, since it was clear and there was no wind. The fire flickered and danced, throwing shadows across the clearing. Sarah and Kevin were relaxed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us again. I kept my gaze fixed on the fire, pretending not to notice the creeping sensations. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping in the distance. It was quieter this time, softer, but it was there. My heart raced and I forced myself to stay still, not wanting to wake Kevin and Sarah, not wanting to seem paranoid. The sounds came and went, like someone or something was circling the campsite, I was nearly on the verge of waking them when I heard something far worse. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. I froze, listening, trying to make sense of it. It was too dark to see much beyond the faint glow of the dying fire. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring into the shadows, waiting for the morning light to break through. When it finally did, I felt a sense of relief. But the feeling of being watched never quite went away. Over the next few days, strange things continued to happen. We'd hear footsteps in the woods, but when we looked, no one was there. Our food supplies were being disturbed. Cans of beans, bags of chips, found moved or partially opened. A few times, I swore I saw someone in the distance, standing perfectly still just out of view. But when I blinked, they were gone. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another camper, maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But the more time passed, the more convinced I became that something was wrong. Kevin and Sarah, of course, thought I was just being paranoid. They tried to convince me to relax, but I couldn't. The forest felt wrong. On the fifth night, I woke up to something that I couldn't ignore. The sound of someone moving around outside our tent. I could hear their breath, shallow and quick. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I barely dared to move. My body was frozen with fear, my mind racing, but I knew I had to do something. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight by my side. I tried to keep my hands steady, but they were shaking uncontrollably. With a deep breath, I flicked the light on and slowly, cautiously, unzipped the tent. My heart nearly stopped when I saw what was standing just a few feet away from us. It was a man. He was tall, gaunt, and wearing tattered clothes. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were wide open, unblinking. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just stared at me, as if he'd been waiting for me to notice him. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. My entire body screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The man took a slow step forward, and that's when I finally broke free from the paralysis of fear. I grabbed Kevin's arm and shook him awake. He sat up, groggy, and looked at the man who hadn't moved. "What the hell?" Kevin muttered, rubbing his eyes, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and disappeared into the woods. We didn't wait to see where he went. We packed up as quickly as we could and left the campsite, not bothering to even take down the tents. We drove back to the nearest town, our hearts still racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. We never spoke about it again, but when I look back, I wonder if we were really alone out there. The woods hide many things that aren't always easy to see, and I can't shake the feeling that we were just lucky to leave when we did. The sun had barely started to dip behind the hills when I pulled up to the cabin. It was a small place, weathered by time, sitting at the edge of a thick forest in the Appalachian Mountains, somewhere in eastern Kentucky. I'd rented it for the weekend, looking for solitude, a chance to unwind from the grind of work, the noise of the city. Just me, the trees, and a bit of quiet, or so I thought. I stepped out of my truck, the gravel crunching under my boots, and took a deep breath of the cool mountain air. It smelled fresh, like pine and earth, but also like something else. Something faintly musty, like old wood and dampness. The cabin was made of logs, with a porch running along the front and a single light flickering above the door. I could see a small creek in the distance, its gentle murmur barely audible above the wind rustling through the trees. The cabin didn't seem like much. A little rundown, maybe. There were a few broken shingles on the roof, the porch had some peeling paint, and the windows were old, fogged up at the edges. It wasn't the perfect vacation spot by any means, but it was exactly what I was looking for. Quiet, isolated. I grabbed my bag from the truck and made my way inside. The door creaked when I opened it, the hinges rusty, but it didn't take much effort to get in. The smell hit me as soon as I crossed the threshold. Wood, dust, and something I couldn't quite place. It didn't smell rotten, just stale. The interior was just as simple as the outside. The main room had a fireplace on one side, a couch that looked like it had seen better days, and a small kitchen off to the left. There was an old wooden dining table with mismatched chairs, and the floors were creaky, like they hadn't been sanded in decades. I dropped my bag on the couch and took a moment to look around, getting a feel for the place. Felt safe enough. Lonely, yes, but peaceful. After a few minutes, I went to the kitchen and found the basics. A fridge that looked ancient, a stove with a couple of burners that seemed functional, and a sink that had a slow drain. There were some canned goods in the pantry and a few bottles of water in the fridge. Perfect for a weekend alone. I wasn't planning on doing much cooking, just simple meals. I'd come for the solitude, not the amenities. The first night was quiet, nothing out of the ordinary. I sat by the fireplace for a while, reading a book I'd brought along. The crackle of the flames was the only sound besides the occasional gust of wind outside. Every now and then, I would hear a thud from somewhere in the cabin. I figured it was just the house settling. It was old after all. But as the night wore on, I started to feel something. A creeping unease that I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the isolation, the silence, or the way the wind howled outside. But I started to get the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. It wasn't until I was about to head to bed that I heard the first unmistakable noise. A scraping sound like something dragging across the floor. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Came from the back of the cabin, from the bedroom. I was sure of it. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept toward the hallway, trying to keep my footsteps as silent as possible. The sound came again, faint but clear. Something heavy, dragging slowly. My stomach turned. I was alone in this cabin. I knew I was. The thought of someone else being here, that wasn't possible. I reached the door to the bedroom and hesitated, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The light flickered once before I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the windows closed tight, and nothing appeared out of place. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was nothing. The wind, or an animal, something outside. My nerves were getting the best of me. I shut the door and went back to the living room, sitting down on the couch, trying to push the feeling out of my mind. But then, the scraping noise came again, louder this time. I was certain it came from the kitchen, followed by a thud. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the flashlight and stood up. Every step I took toward the kitchen felt heavier, like I was walking through water. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? Was someone really in here with me? I reached the kitchen doorway and stopped. The room was dark, but I could just make out shapes in the gloom. The flashlight beam landed on the floor near the back door. And there, in the dim light, I saw something that froze me in place. A trail of dirt and leaves, smeared across the floor, leading from the back door to the far corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat. The door was locked when I got here. I had checked it myself. There was no way anyone could have come in without me hearing them. The dirt, it was like something had been dragged through the cabin. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, and every instinct screamed at me to get out. But where would I go? The cabin was isolated. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and it was dark. I didn't have a phone signal out here. My only choice was to stay inside and wait until daylight. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, the flashlight in my hand, listening for any sound that might suggest someone. Something was nearby. But the rest of the night passed without incident. The scraping sound stopped, and I was left with only my nervous thoughts for company. The next morning, I woke up early, the sun just beginning to rise. I felt exhausted, but I knew I needed to check the cabin again. I couldn't just let it go. The dirt trail was still there, but there was something else now. A small pile of leaves near the back door, piled up almost like it had been intentionally placed there. I couldn't make sense of it. My heart was still pounding from the previous night, and every little noise seemed to send me into a panic. But I couldn't stay on edge forever. I had to finish what I came here to do. I decided to head into town, even though it wasn't much of a town. A few miles down the road, there was a small convenience store, and I needed to clear my head. I needed to talk to someone, to make sure I wasn't going crazy. When I got there, I didn't say much at first, just grabbed some snacks and a soda. The clerk, an older woman, looked up at me with a knowing gaze. "Cabin by the creek?" she asked, as if she already knew. I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, is there something about it?" She just smiled a little, a hint of something I couldn't quite place in her eyes. "Just be careful," she said. "Cabins out there have a way of getting to people." I wasn't sure what she meant, but it only added to the growing unease I felt. I paid for my things and left, heading back to the cabin with a feeling of dread in my stomach. When I got back, everything seemed normal. The dirt trail was still there, but no other signs of disturbance. I spent the rest of the day outside, trying to get some fresh air, walking by the creek, doing my best to ignore the heavy feeling that kept pressing down on me. By the time evening came, I was sitting on the porch, trying to enjoy the sunset. But the quiet wasn't comforting anymore. The silence pressed in on me, making my skin crawl. I thought I saw something moving in the trees, just out of the corner of my eye. I stood up, heart racing, but when I looked, nothing was there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up until dawn, listening to the wind and the creaks of the cabin. But as the first light of morning broke through the trees, I felt better. I don't know why. Maybe it was the fact that I'd survived the night. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't heard that scraping sound again. I packed up my things and left the cabin that morning, not looking back. I didn't know what had been going on, what I had heard, or why it felt so wrong. All I knew was that I wasn't sticking around to find out. The road back to the town felt like a release, a breath of fresh air after weeks of holding my breath. The cabin stayed behind, silent and empty, its old wood creaking in the wind. But for me, it would always remain a mystery. Something about it was wrong, and I would never quite shake the feeling that I wasn't alone that night. The cabin sat in a remote stretch of woods, nestled on the edge of a thick forest. I had rented it for a weekend getaway, hoping to escape the noise of city life. The year was 2023, and I was in my late 20s, just a regular guy looking for some peace and quiet. I didn't expect much, just a few days to recharge, get some fresh air, and maybe even do a little hiking if I was up for it. I didn't think the weekend would turn into something I'd never forget. The drive to the cabin was long. I had rented a car for the trip, leaving my apartment in the city behind. The last few miles had been on a narrow, winding dirt road, where the trees crowded in close, their branches nearly blocking out the sunlight. It was the kind of place where you could feel the isolation, like the rest of the world didn't exist anymore. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was a little relieved to see it. A small, one-story building with a wooden porch, just as the listing had shown. It wasn't much, but it looked cozy enough. The air smelled fresh, like pine and earth, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. There was no one else around for miles, no other cabins in sight. The nearest town was about an hour's drive away, and there was no cell service. It felt peaceful, like I had stepped into a world where time moved slower. The cabin was older than I expected. The wood was weathered, but not in a way that made it look abandoned, just well used. The door creaked as I opened it, and the smell inside was a mix of old wood and something faintly musty, like the place hadn't been aired out in a while. It was clean enough, though, and everything seemed to be in order. There was a small living area with a couch, a stone fireplace, and a wooden coffee table. The kitchen had all the basics: a stove, a fridge, a sink, and some pots and pans. The bedroom was at the back of the cabin, and there was a small bathroom off to the side. It wasn't luxurious, but it would do. After unpacking my things, I decided to head outside and explore the surroundings. The weather was nice, cool enough to be comfortable but not too cold. The woods stretched out behind the cabin, dense and full of life. The air was clean, and the forest was quiet, aside from the occasional bird call. I walked for a while, just enjoying the solitude, letting the peace of the place settle over me. That evening, after I cooked a simple meal, I sat outside on the porch with a beer, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky turned a deep purple, and the first stars began to appear. It was beautiful, almost surreal, how quiet it was. No traffic, no people, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I knew I'd made the right choice by coming here. That night, I slept soundly, the kind of deep sleep that only comes when you're far removed from the stress of daily life. The bed was comfortable enough, and the warmth from the wood stove kept the cabin cozy. But the next morning, something was off. It wasn't anything huge, just little things. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. I got up early, around 6 a.m., when the sky was still dark, the air chilly. The silence outside seemed heavier, like the world was holding its breath. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat on the porch, and watched as the sky slowly brightened. But there was no movement in the woods, no birds, no animals. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe it was just early, and decided to go for a hike. There was a trail that ran through the woods, marked by a few scattered signs, and I thought it would be a good way to stretch my legs. The forest seemed darker today, the trees more oppressive, though it wasn't anything that made me feel truly uneasy, just different. I'd hiked before, and the woods were nothing new to me, but as I walked, I started to notice something strange. The forest was too quiet, the usual sounds of animals and insects absent. It was almost as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I kept walking, my boots crunching on the forest floor. The trees grew denser as I went deeper into the woods, their branches reaching up like fingers, blocking out more and more of the sky. The trail twisted and turned, winding its way through the dense underbrush. I lost track of time, but I didn't care. I was alone, and the feeling of being so far removed from civilization was both comforting and unsettling. The silence was almost suffocating, like the woods were hiding something from me. Eventually, I came across something I hadn't expected. An old, decaying shack. It was half hidden in the trees, its roof caved in, and the wood was rotting, the whole structure on the verge of falling apart. The door hung off its hinges, and I felt an odd mix of curiosity and caution wash over me. I stepped closer, but something about the place didn't feel right. I should have turned around then, but for some reason I didn't. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning with age. Inside, the air was damp and musty, the smell of mold thick in the air. There was nothing much left inside, just a few old, broken furniture pieces and scattered debris. But as I looked around, something caught my eye. A faded photograph lying on the floor near the corner. I bent down to pick it up, brushing the dust off the surface. The photo was old, black and white, showing a group of people standing in front of a cabin. There was no date, but the style of clothing suggested it was taken decades ago. The people in the photo looked normal enough, just a group of friends or family smiling for the camera. But there was something off about the image. In the background, barely visible, was another figure. Just a shadow, but enough to make my skin crawl. I couldn't make out any details, but I had a strange feeling that it was watching them. Watching me. I stood there for a moment, staring at the photo, my heart beating a little faster. The feeling that something wasn't right deepened, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. Without thinking, I turned and walked out of the shack. My steps hurried. The rest of the day passed slowly. I returned to the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The woods didn't seem as peaceful anymore. They felt oppressive, like they were watching me. I tried to push the thoughts aside, telling myself I was just imagining things, but I couldn't help it. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind outside, seemed louder than usual. I kept hearing noises, scratching at the door, footsteps on the porch. But when I would check, there was nothing there. It was all in my head, I told myself. But the unease wouldn't go away. The next morning, I woke up to the unmistakable sound of something moving around outside the cabin. I froze, my heart racing. The cabin wasn't much, but it felt like the kind of place that could be easily invaded. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. What I saw froze me in place. There, just beyond the tree line, was a figure. I couldn't make out any details at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw that it was a man. He was standing motionless, staring at the cabin. His clothes were ragged, his hair wild. He looked like he hadn't seen civilization in years. I couldn't see his face clearly, but the way he stood there, unmoving, made my blood run cold. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I didn't know who he was or why he was out there, but I wasn't going to find out. I grabbed my keys, shoved them into my pocket, and ran out the door. I didn't even bother locking up the cabin. I made it to the car and sped down the dirt road, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the town, my hands still trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew I wouldn't be returning to that cabin. Not ever. When I got home, I checked the old photograph again, just to see if I'd missed something. I zoomed in on the shadowy figure in the background. This time, I could see it more clearly. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a man who looked eerily familiar. The realization hit me like a punch. The man in the photograph looked exactly like the one I had seen standing outside the cabin. It was early October when I decided to take some time off and head into the woods. I was in my early 30s, working a desk job in a small town in northern Michigan, and the daily grind had been wearing me down. The idea of a quiet, remote cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. I rented the place for a week, just me and the forest, no distractions. The cabin was situated about an hour from the nearest town, perched on the edge of a thick pine forest, next to a small, stagnant lake. It was an old cabin, rustic and simple, with nothing more than a wood-burning stove for heat and a few basic amenities. But it had a charm, a solitude I was craving. When I first arrived, I thought the place was beautiful, perfect for what I needed. The air smelled fresh, clean, and the sound of the wind through the trees was oddly calming. The cabin was tucked away on a dirt road, with barely a trace of civilization in sight. The only neighbors were miles away, and there was no Wi-Fi or cell service. It felt like I was stepping into another world, one where time moved slower and people didn't matter. The owner of the cabin had left me a note on the counter when I arrived, giving me a few pointers about the wood stove and warning me about the occasional bear sighting in the area. There was also a map detailing some nearby hiking trails and a small dock near the lake. It looked like the perfect spot to relax, read, and disconnect. The first couple of days were peaceful. I spent my mornings walking through the woods, listening to the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the distant call of birds. I spent the afternoons sitting by the lake, reading, and watching the slow movement of the water. The evenings were spent by the fire in the cabin, cooking simple meals and watching the flames flicker in the stove. I felt a calm settling into me, the kind that only comes when you are far from everything. But as the days passed, I started to feel a strange unease creeping in. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a slight tension, a subtle awareness that I was alone in a place that had no one else around for miles. At night, the silence in the woods was so complete that it felt unnatural, like everything was holding its breath. The first incident happened on the third night. It was late, around 11 p.m., and I was lying in bed, the soft sound of the wind outside barely noticeable. The fire in the stove had died down to glowing embers, and the only light in the cabin came from the moonlight filtering through the windows. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it, a noise outside. It was faint, at first, like something moving through the brush just beyond the cabin. I lay still, listening, trying to make sense of the sound. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. The sound was heavier, deliberate, like someone walking through the woods, dragging something along with them. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon, but something about the rhythm of the sound felt wrong. I tried to shake it off, but my mind kept returning to it. The noise went on for several minutes, then stopped. I waited for a long time, listening. There was no more sound, just the night. I didn't sleep much that night, tossing and turning, feeling paranoid for no good reason. The next morning, I went outside to see if I could find any tracks or signs of what might have made the noise. There was nothing. The ground around the cabin was covered in thick pine needles, and the only traces of life were a few animal tracks in the mud near the lake. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The days went by, and each night, the unease grew. I heard the noises again, always just as I was about to fall asleep. Sometimes they were close, other times farther away. The worst part was that I never saw anything. No shadows in the trees, no figures moving through the woods, just the sound. And it wasn't just the walking anymore. It started to sound like something was scratching at the cabin's walls. By the fifth night, I was feeling on edge. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that the isolation and the quiet were messing with me, but I couldn't deny what I was hearing. That night, I decided to stay up. I sat in a chair by the window, the fire crackling softly behind me, listening to the darkness outside. The cabin creaked with the settling of wood, and the wind blew through the trees. Everything seemed normal at first. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the wood. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the woodshed. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, more deliberate. My heart raced in my chest. I stood up and crept to the door, my hand gripping the handle. I had no idea what I was going to do if I opened it. There was no one around for miles, and I was armed only with a small hunting knife that I'd brought along for peace of mind. I opened the door slowly, my breath caught in my throat. The moonlight was bright enough to illuminate the trees in the distance, but the area around the cabin was shrouded in shadow. The scraping stopped the moment the door cracked open. I stepped outside, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. I looked around, scanning the darkness. There was nothing. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then I saw it. A set of footprints, fresh in the mud near the woodshed. They were large, heavy footprints, and they weren't there when I checked earlier in the day. Whoever had made them had come close to the cabin. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The footsteps led into the woods, and I could hear nothing else. No rustling, no movement, just the wind. For some reason, I couldn't bring myself to go after them. I didn't want to find out who or what had been out there. Instead, I locked the door and stayed inside for the rest of the night, too scared to leave. The next morning, I packed up my things. I knew I couldn't stay another night in that cabin, not with the sense that someone or something was out there. I didn't know who it was or what they wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. As I loaded my car, I took one last look at the cabin, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure in the window. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but the sight of it made my heart race. I drove away as fast as I could, not looking back until I reached the nearest town. When I got back to my apartment, I called the owner of the cabin to let them know what had happened. They seemed surprised but assured me that no one else had been up there recently. They suggested I might have heard an animal or something else, though that didn't explain the footsteps. I never went back to that cabin, but every once in a while, when I'm walking through the woods, I hear something, like a footstep, a branch breaking, or the sound of something dragging along the ground. And I always wonder if I was just imagining things, or if there really was someone out there that night. The wind was relentless as it howled through the trees, and I watched from the window of the old cabin as the first signs of night began to settle in. My fingers were stiff from holding the flashlight too long, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. There was something eerie about the way the forest seemed to be closing in around me. The tall, twisted trees had a way of making the night feel even darker, as if they were hiding something just beyond sight. I wasn't used to this kind of isolation, but I had chosen it. I'd always been someone who needed space, who needed quiet. I thought spending a weekend alone in this little cabin, located deep in the Appalachian mountains, would give me the peace I was looking for. I was wrong. I had arrived earlier that afternoon, feeling the excitement of escaping the city. The drive up had been longer than expected, but I figured it was all part of the experience. When I first saw the cabin, it was quaint and old, nothing like the modern vacation homes I had grown accustomed to. The wood was weathered and peeling in places, but it had character. It was perfect for what I wanted, or so I thought. Inside, it wasn't much. A small living room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a couple of bedrooms with threadbare furniture, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew. There were no luxuries, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just the bare essentials. But that was the point. I had come to get away from everything. The cabin was situated at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by dense forest on every side. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. I loved it. That first evening, I spent my time unpacking, organizing my food, and starting a fire in the hearth. The smell of burning wood was comforting, and I felt a sense of calm as the flames crackled in the fireplace. After dinner, I went for a short walk around the cabin, taking in the beauty of the place. The air was crisp, and the sky was clear, with a scattering of stars twinkling above. As I walked further into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The trees were dense here, their branches twisting and intertwining to block out most of the light. The ground was soft with moss, and the silence was almost oppressive. I had heard stories about people getting lost in these woods, but I wasn't worried. I was a seasoned hiker and I had a good sense of direction. Still, I turned back after only a few minutes. Something about this place made me uneasy. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and settled in for the night. The wind outside was picking up, and I could hear the occasional creak of the cabin settling as the temperature dropped. I wrapped myself in a blanket and pulled a book from my bag, trying to relax, but my mind kept wandering back to the woods. There was something about them, something that felt wrong. I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to the isolation. I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a thud. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The noise seemed to come from outside, near the back of the cabin. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight, but I didn't want to make any noise. What if someone was out there? Someone who didn't belong? The wind was still howling, but it wasn't the wind making that noise. I could hear something moving around out there, something heavy. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer or a bear, but the noise didn't sound like anything natural. It was too deliberate, too calculated. I lay there, frozen, listening for any other sounds. The noise stopped for a moment, and I held my breath, waiting. Then it came again. A soft thud followed by a scraping sound, as though something was dragging itself along the ground. I felt a chill run down my spine. I waited a few minutes, my heart racing in my chest, before slowly standing up and reaching for the flashlight. My hand was shaking as I clicked it on, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. I crept toward the window and carefully pulled back the heavy curtain. For a moment, I didn't see anything. The forest beyond the cabin was still, the only movement coming from the wind shaking the branches. But then I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it was staring directly at me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, as though it was looking right into my soul. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Was it a person? A hunter, perhaps? But the way it stood there, motionless, made me think otherwise. I couldn't explain it, but there was something deeply unsettling about the figure. Something that made me feel like I wasn't supposed to be here. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed up, sitting in the corner of the room, clutching the flashlight in my hands. I didn't dare make a sound, not even the slightest movement. The figure was still there, watching. I couldn't tell how long it stayed, but eventually, I fell into a fitful sleep, only to wake with the first light of dawn. When I looked outside, the figure was gone, but the feeling of unease remained. It was as if the forest was pressing in on me, suffocating me with its silence. I packed up my things and decided to leave. I couldn't stay another night, but when I went to the front door, I found something strange. The doorknob had been twisted, as though someone had tried to open it. But the door hadn't been forced, and there was no sign of anyone having entered the cabin. I didn't know what to think. Was it just my imagination? Had I really seen someone out there? I left the cabin in a hurry, never looking back as I made my way down the long, winding road toward the nearest town. I didn't care if I left half my gear behind. I just wanted to get out of those woods. As I drove away, the wind continued to howl through the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me, waiting for me to return. I never thought I'd be the type of person to go on a solo trip to a cabin in the middle of nowhere. My name's Ethan. I'm 29 years old and live in the city, working a regular 9-to-5 job. But after a long year of work and stress, I decided I needed a break. Somewhere quiet, where no one could reach me. No calls, no emails, just peace. I found a cabin listed online, tucked away in the woods just outside of Bear Creek, a small town in upstate New York. The listing promised seclusion, beautiful views of the forest, and an old, rustic charm. The price was affordable, and the reviews were all glowing, perfect for an escape. It took me nearly 5 hours to drive from the city to the cabin. The roads were narrow and winding, with trees growing so close they almost seemed to lean over the path. As I got closer, the last bit of the drive was a dirt road, and the GPS signal started to fade, leaving me to navigate by instinct. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dense forest, and I could hear the sound of crunching leaves under my tires. When I finally arrived, I was relieved to see the cabin standing there, just as the pictures showed. It was small, with a slanted roof and a wide front porch, surrounded by trees on all sides. A couple of wooden chairs sat on the porch, facing the forest. A small stream ran behind the cabin, and I could hear the gentle rush of water. I unloaded my bags and stepped inside. The cabin was old but well kept. The wood had that unmistakable smell of pine, and the interior was cozy, with a stone fireplace and a small kitchen. The furniture was simple but comfortable. I felt a wave of relaxation wash over me. For the first time in a long while, I felt at ease. That first evening was calm. I made a simple meal, lit the fireplace, and settled in with a book. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. I remember feeling that perfect sense of solitude. No distractions, no responsibilities, just the quiet of nature. But as the night wore on, I began to notice something strange. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a slight discomfort in the air, as if the stillness of the woods had grown too thick. I shrugged it off, blaming my city-bred nerves. The wind picked up outside, causing the trees to sway and groan, but I didn't think much of it. I was alone, but I told myself I was safe. Around 10 p.m., I decided to head to bed. The cabin was completely dark except for the soft glow of the fire, and as I lay in the small bedroom, I tried to calm my mind. But there was something off. Every now and then, I heard the sound of something moving outside. Not a wind-driven branch, but something heavier. A thud, then another, almost like footsteps. At first, I assumed it was an animal, perhaps a deer or some other creature, moving quietly through the woods. I kept my flashlight nearby just in case. But after a while, the noises grew louder, closer. It was as though something was circling the cabin. My heart started to race. I told myself it was nothing. After all, the cabin was secluded, wildlife was common in these parts. I tried to ignore the noise, but it wasn't easy. The more I tried to relax, the more aware I became of every creak in the cabin, every rustle outside. I finally drifted off to sleep, only to be woken up by a loud bang against the side of the cabin. My eyes snapped open, and my heart skipped a beat. I could hear my breath echoing in the silence. The banging came again, harder this time, like someone or something was hitting the walls. Panic set in. I grabbed my flashlight and jumped out of bed, moving quickly to the window. I shone the beam outside, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing, just the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. My nerves were fraying, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped. I waited, barely breathing, listening intently for any sound that would confirm my fear, but there was nothing. Slowly, I returned to bed, telling myself that it was just the wind, that it was nothing more than the natural sounds of a forest at night. Still, sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, the sun was up, and the cabin was bathed in light. It felt almost surreal, like the events of the night before had been a bad dream. I decided to go for a hike to clear my head and stretch my legs. The air was fresh, the birds were chirping, and the forest was alive with sounds that seemed far less threatening in the daylight. I took a trail that led deeper into the woods, following it along the edge of the stream that ran behind the cabin. The trees were thick, their leaves shimmering in the sunlight. It was beautiful, tranquil, the kind of nature I'd been craving. I spent hours walking, lost in the peace of it all. But as I turned a bend in the trail, I found something that made my stomach drop. A campsite. It wasn't far from the cabin, hidden by the trees, but clearly visible once I was close enough. There were remnants of a fire pit, and nearby, some old tarps were hanging between trees. But it wasn't the campsite itself that made me uneasy. It was the fresh footprints leading to and from it. They were big, heavy, and recent, likely made in the past day or two. They were the kind of footprints that didn't belong to any animal I recognized. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the footprints led directly toward the cabin. It didn't make sense. Why would someone be out here so close to my cabin without any obvious reason? I didn't want to linger. I turned and headed back to the cabin, but as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I kept glancing over my shoulder. When I returned to the cabin, I locked the door behind me. I checked every window, made sure everything was in place. I even went outside to look around, but there was nothing unusual. The cabin sat quietly, as it always had. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That night, I decided to take extra precautions. I moved a heavy chair in front of the door and made sure the windows were secure. I didn't expect anyone to break in, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I set up my flashlight next to the bed, just in case. Around midnight, I heard it again. That same noise, the sound of something hitting the side of the cabin. This time, it was harder, more deliberate. The noise echoed through the walls, rattling the wood. My pulse quickened, and I grabbed the flashlight, turning it on. I quickly scanned the room, but the cabin was dark and still. I knew then that I wasn't imagining it. Whoever or whatever was out there was trying to get in. I didn't have a phone signal, and there was no way to call for help. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I felt trapped. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to think of my options. After a few moments, the banging stopped again. I waited. My mind raced. Should I go outside to confront it? Should I stay inside and lock myself in? I didn't know what to do. Suddenly, I heard a soft voice from outside. It wasn't loud enough to make out words, but it was unmistakable. Someone was out there, talking, but it was so low, so faint, that I couldn't understand what they were saying. I froze. The voice came again, just as soft, almost like a whisper. It felt like the woods themselves were pressing in on me. The weight of the silence, the unknown, everything was suffocating. Without thinking, I grabbed the key to the cabin and slipped out the back door. I moved quietly, trying not to make a sound. The woods were eerily still, the only sound being the crunch of leaves underfoot. My heart was in my throat as I crept through the trees, heading toward the road. I reached the main road about 15 minutes later, and as I looked back at the cabin in the distance, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was just a silhouette against the moonlit backdrop. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew in my gut that I was no longer alone. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran. Eventually, I made it back to Bear Creek. My heart was pounding as I entered the small town. I found a local inn and paid for a room, deciding I couldn't go back to the cabin. Not tonight. Not after what I saw. The next day, I called the police and told them about the strange footprints, the noises, and the figure I'd seen in the woods. They promised to look into it, but I'm not sure they believed me. They thought it was probably someone camping nearby, but I knew better. When I finally made my way back to the cabin to pack up and leave, I found the door wide open. The heavy chair I had moved in front of it was pushed aside, and the place was ransacked. Whoever had been out there knew exactly what they were doing. I left, and I haven't been back to that cabin since. Now, I tell people my story, and I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I'm certain that something or someone was watching me that night. And I'll never forget the way the woods seemed to close in on me, the whispers in the trees, and the figure standing just beyond the shadows. I may never know the truth, but I know one thing for sure. The cabin sat nestled in the woods, far from any nearby neighbors or towns. I had come here for some peace and quiet, a retreat from the constant buzz of my everyday life. It was the beginning of October, the air crisp and cool with the promise of the coming winter. My name is Alex, and I'm 32 years old. I had booked this cabin through a website, looking for a place to escape the noise of the city for a few days. When I pulled up, the place seemed perfect, just isolated enough to feel like an escape, but not too far that I couldn't get help if I needed it. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't like the quiet of a city night, where you can still hear distant traffic or the hum of streetlights. No, this was the kind of silence that swallowed everything. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves, no distant animal sounds. The kind of silence that presses on your ears until you start hearing your own heartbeat. The cabin itself was an old, wooden structure built some time ago, maybe in the 70s, maybe earlier. There were signs of wear and tear. The paint peeling from the walls, the roof a little sagging. But it wasn't falling apart, not by any means. The place had character. I liked that. It gave the feeling that I wasn't just staying in a house, but in something that had its own history, its own stories. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the old, stone fireplace. It crackled and popped, sending warmth into the cold air of the cabin. As the sun set, the world outside seemed to grow even quieter, and the chill in the air deepened. I sat in front of the fire, sipping on some coffee, and thought about how lucky I was to have this time to myself. But then, something unusual happened. I heard a noise outside, a faint but distinct sound like something dragging along the ground. My first thought was that it was some animal, maybe a deer or a bear, dragging a branch or something. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was just nature doing its thing. But then the noise came again, this time louder, more deliberate. It was coming from behind the cabin. I sat up, my heart beating a little faster. I wasn't scared, not yet, but I was curious. The cabin was in a pretty remote area, and I didn't expect anyone else to be around. I grabbed a flashlight and stood up, feeling the cool air of the room rush past me as I walked toward the back door. As I stepped outside, I immediately noticed how dark it was. The kind of dark where you can't see your own hand in front of your face, even if it's right there. I flicked on the flashlight and swept it across the yard, but there was nothing. The trees stood still, their dark branches stretching high into the sky. The air smelled of earth and pine. I checked behind the cabin, but there was nothing there, just a small clearing and the thick woods beyond. I stood there for a moment, listening. The dragging sound had stopped. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me. I was alone in the woods, after all. It was easy to start imagining things, especially when you're trying to relax. I turned back to the cabin and went inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house made me stir. Every shift in the wind outside had me listening intently. I didn't feel in danger, but there was an unease that lingered. The fire had died down, leaving the room in a dull, gray light. My watch showed that it was just past midnight. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my racing thoughts. And then, the noise came again. At first, it was faint, like the scraping of something across the floor, but it grew louder, more pronounced. I sat up quickly, listening intently. The sound was coming from inside the cabin. The floorboards creaked as if someone or something was walking around. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the sound, but it was coming from the far corner of the room. My heart raced, and I felt the cold sweat start to trickle down my back. No one should have been there. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and the door had been locked. I got up slowly, feeling the floor shift under my feet with each step. The light from my flashlight barely illuminated the darkness ahead. I reached the corner of the room, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. My eyes scanned the area, looking for whatever was causing the noise. Nothing. I checked the windows, but they were still sealed shut. The door was locked, and there were no other exits. I even checked the chimney. It wasn't big enough for anyone to climb down, and the fire had gone out hours ago. The sound stopped, as if it had never been there in the first place. I went back to bed, but this time, I pulled the blankets tightly around me, the feeling of unease still pressing in on me. I eventually fell asleep, but it wasn't peaceful. I dreamt of the noise, of dragging sounds and things moving in the darkness. The next morning, I went about my day as planned. I took a long walk through the woods, breathing in the cool air, trying to shake off the lingering unease. I didn't tell anyone about the night's events. It felt foolish, really, to get worked up over nothing. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the noise came back. This time, it wasn't just dragging. There were footsteps, clear, deliberate footsteps, someone walking around the cabin. I didn't hesitate this time. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was colder now, and the wind had picked up, rustling the branches of the trees. I searched the yard with the beam of light, but again, there was nothing. Just the trees, the shadows, the silence. I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind, but then I saw it. Near the edge of the clearing, something was moving. At first, it looked like a figure, but it was too blurry, too fast for me to make out. I took a step forward, but it disappeared into the woods. My mind raced. Was it a person, or was it just an animal? I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, but the fear wouldn't let me. I went back inside the cabin and locked the door behind me. I checked the windows again, the door, everything. The night passed in silence. The next morning, I left the cabin. I didn't feel safe anymore. The whole place, once peaceful and isolated, now felt like a trap. My car was parked just a short walk from the cabin, and I could feel the tension ease as I approached it. I started the engine and drove away without looking back. As I left, I couldn't help but think about the woods behind the cabin, and the feeling I had that something was still out there waiting. The cold wind whipped through the trees, causing the branches to creak and groan, their skeletal limbs scraping the sky. I stood on the edge of the clearing, staring at the small cabin ahead, nestled in the dark woods of northern Michigan. It had been a long drive, and now, after hours of winding roads, I had finally arrived at what was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a retreat from the noise and chaos of my everyday life. The cabin looked worn, but sturdy. It wasn't a grand place, just a modest structure built with logs, the kind you might expect in a place like this. The wood was weathered and gray, with a thin layer of moss growing in the cracks, but it felt welcoming in its own way. I had rented this place for a week to disconnect, to clear my mind after a difficult year. I had told myself it would be good for me, but now, standing here, I wasn't so sure. The isolation of the place felt heavier than I had anticipated, and the silence of the forest around me was unnerving. I grabbed my bags from the back of my truck and made my way toward the cabin. The air smelled of pine and earth, but there was something else too, something faint like damp wood or mildew. As I stepped up to the porch, I noticed that the steps creaked under my weight, the wood splintering in places where the boards had aged and decayed. I paused, looking around, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping up my spine. The cabin was small, but there was a charm to it. A small stone chimney rose from the roof, and there was a pile of wood neatly stacked beside the door. The windows were simple, with faded curtains hanging inside. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the scent of dust and stale air greeted me. The place had clearly been empty for a while. There was a stone fireplace along the far wall, and a few mismatched chairs scattered around a small wooden table. The walls were lined with old photographs of people I didn't recognize, their faces frozen in time. The cabin's interior was simple, just the basics, really. A few chairs, a a small kitchen with an old stove, and a couple of bedrooms tucked away in the back. The bed in the master room had a thick quilt on it, and the window there looked out over the dense forest, where the trees grew so close together it felt like they were watching me. I didn't have any real plans for the night, just to settle in, maybe light a fire, and enjoy the peace and quiet. After unpacking my things, I grabbed some firewood and set it in the fireplace. The crackling of the logs soon filled the room, and the warmth of the fire made the cabin feel more like home. I leaned back in one of the old chairs, staring into the flames, listening to the occasional crack of the logs as they shifted. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The air seemed to grow colder as the night wore on, and I felt a shiver run through me. I tried to focus on the fire, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange feeling I had when I first arrived. Something was off, though I couldn't quite place it. The longer I sat in the cabin, the more the silence began to press in on me. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I had imagined. It was more like a suffocating hush, as if the forest was holding its breath. I decided to go to bed early, hoping a good night's sleep would shake the odd feeling. As I climbed into the bed, I pulled the quilt up around me and tried to settle in. The fire in the living room was still crackling, and I could hear the wind howling outside, but I was too tired to stay awake. Slowly, I drifted off, the unsettling quiet of the cabin lulling me into a restless sleep. At some point during the night, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves. My heart began to race as I listened, straining to hear anything more. The footsteps were close, too close. I sat up in bed, my breath shallow as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. But the sound continued, circling the cabin, moving along the walls, coming closer. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept toward the window. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I peered out, scanning the dark woods. Nothing, just the empty trees and the inky blackness of the night. I slowly exhaled, trying to calm my nerves, but something about the stillness unsettled me. The footsteps had stopped. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, my eyes flicking to the window every time I heard a noise. By morning, I was exhausted, but the strange events of the night had made me more determined to stay. I couldn't leave now, not after coming all this way. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the isolation and the eeriness of the cabin playing tricks on me. The next day, I went for a hike through the woods. The sun was shining, and the air was crisp, but even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something lurking behind the trees. But there was nothing, just the quiet forest stretching out in all directions. Still, I couldn't shake the paranoia that gnawed at me. By the time I returned to the cabin, I was more than ready to be inside, away from the oppressive silence of the woods. That evening, I decided to make a hearty dinner, something to keep my mind off the unease that had been creeping in. I lit a fire in the stove, chopped some vegetables, and threw them into a pot. The warmth of the kitchen was comforting, and the smell of the stew filled the cabin. I ate in silence, the only sound the occasional crack of the fire. But as I finished my meal, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost like a tap, but then it came again, louder this time. My heart skipped a beat. No one was supposed to be out here. I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. I stood frozen, staring at the door, my pulse hammering in my chest. The knock came again, insistent now, as if someone or something was waiting for me to answer. I had no choice. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the door, my hands shaking. When I opened it, there was no one there. Just the empty porch, the night air swirling in the trees. I stepped outside, scanning the darkness. There was nothing, no sign of anyone having been here. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in quick gasps as I stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do. I checked the rest of the cabin, locked every window, and barricaded the door. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still out there, watching me. The next morning, I packed up my things, determined to leave. The thought of spending another night in that cabin, alone, was more than I could handle. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin in the rearview mirror. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and I had the distinct impression that I wasn't the only one who had been in those woods. When I got back to the city, I tried to push the memories of that cabin from my mind, but the feeling of being watched never quite left me. I never went back to that cabin. The woods had swallowed up whatever secrets they held, and I was just another stranger who had crossed their threshold, only to leave again. But every now and then, when I'm alone, I still hear those footsteps in the distance, echoing in my mind, and I wonder if I ever really left at all. The cabin sat at the edge of the forest, far enough from the nearest town to be considered isolated, yet close enough to still be accessible by a dirt road. I had driven up alone to spend a long weekend away from the bustle of the city, thinking it would be a chance to unwind, recharge, and enjoy the peaceful solitude. I was in my mid-30s, a little tired from work, but otherwise fine, nothing extraordinary. The plan was simple: get away from it all, enjoy the fresh air, read a few books, and just relax in the quiet. But it was the quiet that would soon start to weigh heavily on me. The first night, I arrived after dusk. The sky had been thick with clouds all day, and the sun had already set by the time I parked my car in front of the small, wooden cabin. It looked old but sturdy, its wooden exterior darkened with age, and the small windows barely letting any light through. Still, it was charming, and I was glad to be there. I carried my bag inside, dropped it on the rough-hewn wooden floor, and began unpacking. The cabin smelled of pine and dust, the kind of scent that would usually feel comforting. But tonight, it just seemed to fill the space with something a little heavier, a little more oppressive. I lit the fire in the stove, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The cold night air outside only added to the feeling. The wind howled through the trees, pushing against the cabin like it was trying to get inside. It wasn't the typical forest wind I was used to. This felt different, felt alive. Still, I brushed it off as just nerves. It was a new place, and everything felt unfamiliar. I couldn't remember the last time I'd been this far out in the wilderness. The farthest I'd gone before was a couple of campsites near the city. This, though, was deeper in the woods, an hour from any kind of real civilization. The quiet was almost unnerving, but that was what I had come for, wasn't it? To get away from the noise of the world. I made myself some dinner, simple pasta, and ate it by the fire. The crackle of the wood made the silence less heavy, and soon enough, I was feeling more relaxed. But as I cleaned up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I sat in the old chair by the fire and picked up the book I had brought with me. The pages turned slowly, the book feeling heavier as I read. The sound of the wind against the cabin grew louder, but it wasn't the wind that made me uneasy. It was the soft sound that followed it. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but I could swear I heard something else, like a tap or a scratch, coming from the direction of the window. I stood up, a bit too quickly, and walked over to the window. I pulled back the curtain, half expecting to see an animal in the yard or something else that could explain the sound. But there was nothing, just the dark expanse of trees, their branches swaying in the wind. Nothing unusual. Still, the feeling of unease lingered. I told myself to relax, to stop being paranoid, but it wasn't easy. I closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and went to bed. The bed creaked under my weight as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing down on me. Around midnight, I was half asleep when I heard it again. The sound, soft and faint, just like before. A tap, followed by a slight scraping noise. It came from the window again, and this time, I could feel my heart race. I turned toward the window, my mind racing with thoughts. Was it an animal? A tree branch hitting the glass? I got up slowly, trying not to make any noise, and walked toward the window again. This time, when I pulled back the curtain, I was ready to see something, anything that could explain the noise. But again, there was nothing. I stood there for a moment, feeling both stupid and relieved. But as I was about to turn away, I noticed something strange. The snow outside, which had been untouched when I first arrived, had fresh tracks in it. They were faint but unmistakable footprints. Human footprints. They circled the cabin and then disappeared into the forest. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone out here, let alone someone walking around my cabin in the middle of the night. I had driven up alone, and there was no one else around for miles. No one but me. I quickly shut the curtain and backed away from the window. My mind raced. Who could it have been? A hiker lost in the woods? But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling the situation became. No one would be out here at this time of night, especially with the weather turning colder. And why would someone walk in a circle around my cabin before disappearing? I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, I had known there wouldn't be, but in that moment it felt like a cruel joke. Alone in the woods with someone or something outside and no way to call for help. I didn't know what to do. I thought about getting in my car and driving away, but I was too far from civilization to make it out without risking getting lost in the dark. Besides, what if the person was still out there, watching? What if they had been watching me the whole time? I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I sat by the fire, keeping a constant watch on the windows. Every gust of wind, every creak of the cabin, made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whoever or whatever had been out there was still there, waiting. By morning, I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. But the need to leave was stronger than my fatigue. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, trying not to think about the footprints outside or what they meant. But as I stepped outside to load my car, I froze. There, in the fresh snow, were more footprints. They led up to the cabin again, then stopped. No more circles, no more wandering, just the footprints leading up to the door. I couldn't leave fast enough. I started the car, threw it into gear, and drove down the dirt road, not looking back. As I reached the main road and saw the sign for the nearest town, a sense of relief washed over me. But when I turned the corner, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A man standing by the side of the road. His clothes were old, tattered, like they hadn't been washed in days. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were hollow. He didn't wave. He didn't do anything. He just stood there, staring at me as I drove past. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I kept driving, my eyes glued to the road, my heart pounding in my chest. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who the man was or why he was out there, but I'm certain he was the same person who had been walking around my cabin. And I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone out there, and I don't ever want to be again. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The kind of quiet that only comes in places like this. The kind of quiet you don't even realize is there until it's broken. It was late October, and I had decided to get away from everything for a while. I had rented a small cabin in the woods up near a little town called Pine Ridge. I was 29 years old, an office worker who'd gotten fed up with the noise and the endless rush of city life. I wanted something isolated, something peaceful. A place where I could sit by a fire and listen to the crackling wood, far away from the calls of bosses and deadlines. The cabin was tiny, maybe not even 100 years old, but it had a charm about it. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen that seemed as if it hadn't been touched in years. A large window overlooked the thick woods, and you could see the trees just beginning to shed their leaves, their yellow and red colors painting the forest floor in beautiful patches. It was perfect. When I arrived, I unpacked my things and took in my surroundings. Pine Ridge was about an hour away from the nearest town, and I hadn't passed another vehicle in what felt like forever. I was completely alone out there, and at first that was exactly what I wanted. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest. I made myself a simple dinner of canned soup and some bread, then sat by the fire with a book. The crackling sound of the fire was comforting. But as the night grew deeper, the silence around me seemed to intensify. The wind had picked up, but it was the kind of wind that didn't move the trees. It made everything feel still and frozen. Around midnight, I started hearing strange noises from outside. At first, it was nothing more than the rustling of leaves, or perhaps an animal moving through the underbrush. But then it happened again, more distinct this time, like something heavy was walking near the cabin. It wasn't the light patter of a deer or a raccoon, but something with more weight, more purpose. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to brush it off. It's just an animal, I told myself. It's nothing. But then there was a knock. The sound was faint, barely audible over the wind. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but then it came again. 3 sharp knocks on the cabin door. My breath caught in my chest, and I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. I wasn't expecting anyone. This cabin was remote, and the rental agency had told me the nearest neighbor was miles away. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen, or maybe it was an animal knocking against the door. That made sense. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed a flashlight and moved to the door, my heart racing. I didn't open it, but I peered through the window, scanning the area outside. There was nothing. No sign of anyone or anything. Just the dark woods. For a long while, I stood there, waiting, watching. The wind had died down again, leaving the world unnervingly quiet. I finally stepped away from the door, letting out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every small noise made me jump. The bed felt too big and too empty, and the darkness outside the window seemed to grow deeper with each passing minute. I woke up early the next morning, feeling drained but eager to move past whatever had happened the night before. I made coffee and sat by the fire again, watching the sun rise over the trees. The forest was waking up. Birds were calling. The wind was rustling the branches again, and all was calm. I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The cabin was set in the middle of a small clearing, and the trail behind it led deeper into the woods. As I walked, the sounds of the forest surrounded me, but it wasn't the peaceful, soothing sound I'd expected. It felt almost like the woods were watching me, waiting for something. There was an odd unease in the air, something I couldn't quite place. The further I walked, the more I noticed the little things. The broken branches on the ground, the odd marks in the dirt. There were signs of movement, of something big passing through the area, something heavy. It wasn't deer or other forest animals. These were deeper prints, as if a large person had been walking there. But who would be out here? No one should be. I kept walking, trying to push away the sense of dread that was starting to build up in my chest. But the deeper I went, the more unsettled I felt. I had no idea where the trail led, and there was no one around for miles. It was just me and the woods, and that thought felt more like a trap than a comfort. Eventually, I turned back. The air had grown colder, and the shadows were getting longer, making it feel like the world was closing in around me. I hurried back to the cabin, my footsteps quick and uneven as I tried to outrun the feeling creeping along my spine. That evening, I locked the doors and windows as soon as I got inside. The sun set earlier now, and the cabin was plunged into darkness faster than before. I lit the fireplace again, hoping its warmth would ease the strange tension in my shoulders. I didn't sleep that night. Every small sound made my heart race. I kept thinking I could hear something moving around the cabin. It was probably just the wind, but it sounded too close, too deliberate. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was just alone in a strange place and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then the knocking came again. This time it was harder to ignore. 3 knocks on the door, clear and unmistakable. I froze, my pulse thundering in my ears. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. I knew it wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. I grabbed the flashlight again, but I didn't go to the door. I turned the beam of light toward the window, scanning the darkness outside. Nothing. The knock came again, louder this time, shaking the door with a force that rattled the wood. My heart skipped in my chest. I felt like I was suffocating. And then, as quickly as it started, the sound stopped. The world outside was silent again, but now it felt different. More oppressive, more suffocating. I waited for hours, hoping whatever was outside would go away. But the quiet stretched on, too long, too still. At dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up my things, too shaken to stay another night. I didn't care if I lost the rental money. I needed to leave. The woods felt wrong, and the cabin felt like it was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me, something just beyond the trees, something that didn't want me there. I didn't even look back as I drove away, the cabin shrinking in my rearview mirror. I was relieved to get back to civilization, to the hum of traffic and the sound of people. The woods were behind me now, but I couldn't forget them. I don't know what was out there, or who was knocking on my door. Maybe I'll never know. But I do know one thing. I'll never go back to that cabin. The cabin stood at the edge of the forest, deep in the woods of northern Maine. It had always been a quiet spot, secluded, the perfect place for someone like me who wanted nothing but peace and isolation. I'm Alex, 28, and I'd been working non-stop for months. Long hours in a high-pressure job that left me exhausted, restless, and craving silence. When I decided to take a break, I rented the cabin, hoping it would be the perfect escape. It was late October, the time when the trees were all shades of orange and red, the air crisp with the promise of winter coming soon. The cabin was small, built out of logs that creaked with the wind but felt sturdy enough. There were no neighbors for miles, just a few scattered homes over a dozen miles away. The nearest town was even farther, tucked behind more miles of dense forest. I arrived around 6:30 p.m., just as the last slivers of sunlight were disappearing. The drive up had been long and uneventful. I didn't even see another car the entire route. The cabin had been well maintained, but I could tell it was old, maybe 60 or 70 years old. It had a charm to it that made it feel homely, even though it was so isolated. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. It was a mix of wood and dust, a scent that told me this place had been untouched for a while. I had no problem with that, though. The quiet was exactly what I wanted. I dropped my bags by the door and moved to the windows, pulling back the heavy curtains to see the forest outside. It was a wall of trees, stretching for miles in every direction. After taking a moment to settle, I started a fire in the small stone fireplace. The crackling flames filled the silence, and for a moment, I felt at peace. I had no plans to leave the cabin for the entire weekend. No plans to do anything but relax, read a book, and maybe take a hike or two if the weather was nice. As I sat there in front of the fire, I noticed something strange. It was quiet, almost too quiet. No birds, no rustling of animals, not even the sound of wind in the trees. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that began to creep up on me. I told myself it was just the isolation, that I wasn't used to such complete silence. I had spent the last few years in a city, surrounded by constant noise. By 8 p.m., the fire had burned down to glowing embers, and I went to bed. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, though the sheets felt old. I turned off the lamp beside it, letting the room go dark. I felt my body relax as I lay there in the quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I don't know how long it had been, but I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. There was a sound. It was faint at first, like a soft thud, then a scraping noise, like something dragging across the floor. My body stiffened, and my breath caught in my throat. I waited, straining my ears in the darkness. I didn't hear it again. I tried to convince myself it was just the old house settling, the wind, maybe even an animal outside. I eventually fell back asleep, but the rest of the night felt fitful. I woke up several more times, each time hearing faint noises, scraping, thuds, something that felt like movement. But when I checked the house, there was nothing. No sign of anything that would explain the sounds. The next day, I decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. I walked through the woods for about 2 hours, the sun making its way across the sky, the silence broken only by my footsteps. I didn't come across anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a constant feeling, but in the moments when the wind stopped and everything went still, I felt eyes on me. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the snow outside. They weren't there before, I was sure of it. They were large, heavy prints like someone wearing boots, but they weren't mine. My first thought was that maybe someone else had been walking nearby, but I didn't remember hearing a car or seeing anyone else while I was out. I didn't even know where the prints led. They seemed to circle the cabin in a random pattern, and then they stopped. The unease from the previous night returned, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just someone else using the woods for hiking, though I couldn't explain why I hadn't seen anyone. I decided to lock up the doors and windows, double-checking everything as nightfall came. As the night wore on, the strange noises started again. The scraping and thudding sounds, now closer and more persistent. I couldn't ignore them this time. I got out of bed and moved quietly through the cabin, checking every room. The house was empty. I checked the windows, the locks, and even the small storage room where I kept some extra supplies, but nothing seemed amiss. I felt silly, standing there in the dark, listening to the silence again, wondering if I was just overthinking things. But then the noises came again. The scrape, the thud. It was outside this time, coming from somewhere along the side of the cabin. My heart was pounding now. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly moved to the door, pulling the heavy coat around me. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but the feeling that something wasn't right was too strong to ignore. I opened the door, shining the light outside. The beam swept over the trees and the snow, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, no sign of any disturbance. I took a few cautious steps out, the cold biting at my skin. The light flicked over the ground again, and that's when I saw it. A small, dark object on the ground by the side of the cabin. I walked over to it, my heart still pounding. When I got closer, I realized it was a broken branch, splintered and bent at an odd angle, as if it had been snapped in a hurry. It was the kind of branch that could only break if someone had stepped on it with force. Someone had been out here, and they were close. I retreated back inside, locking the door behind me and pressing my back to it. My mind raced with questions. Who was out there? What did they want? I tried to keep calm, but the thought that someone else was watching me, waiting for something, made my stomach churn. I paced the cabin, looking out the windows, but saw nothing. The silence was almost deafening now. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin made me tense up, and every flicker of movement in the shadows made my skin crawl. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up my things, my fingers trembling as I shoved clothes and equipment into my bag. I couldn't stay another night, not with this strange feeling gnawing at me. As I was loading the last of my bags into the car, I heard the faintest sound behind me, a soft, almost imperceptible footstep. I turned, but there was nothing. The forest stood still and silent. The wind hadn't picked up, and the trees didn't rustle. It was the first time in hours that I hadn't felt like I was being watched, but something about that moment still felt wrong. I got in the car and started the engine roaring to life and cutting through the silence like a shout. As I drove away from the cabin, the road stretched ahead, winding through the trees. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road, watching me go. But the mirror remained empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, close to the cabin, and I had barely escaped. I didn't tell anyone about the strange events in the woods. I didn't need to. I knew the truth, and I had my peace again. Sometimes that's all you need. I don't know who had been watching me, or why they chose to leave me alone that night, but I never went back to that cabin. I knew better than to test my luck. Some places were best left untouched, and some memories were better left behind. I had always loved the idea of escaping the chaos of daily life. So when I stumbled across a small cabin for rent in the remote woods of North Carolina, I didn't hesitate. It was a last-minute decision, something I hadn't even really planned. But there I was, 34 years old, packing my things and heading out to a secluded spot that promised peace and quiet. I wanted to disconnect for a few days, clear my head, and enjoy nature without distractions. The cabin was nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far from the nearest town. The road leading to it was barely more than a dirt path, which I took as a good sign. The less accessible it was, the more likely it was to be peaceful. I could hear the sound of my tires crunching over gravel as I made my way along the narrow, winding road, the trees pressing in on either side, creating a dark canopy overhead. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. There were no houses in sight, no signs of life except for the occasional rustling of wildlife in the underbrush. When I finally reached the cabin, it wasn't much to look at, but it had character. A small, one-story structure made of weathered wood, sitting crookedly on the edge of a clearing. The porch creaked beneath my boots as I stepped out of the car, and I took in the surroundings. The land stretched out behind it, a wild, untamed forest that seemed to go on forever. It was perfect. I grabbed my bags and went inside. The cabin's interior was just as rustic as the outside. A stone fireplace stood in one corner, with a few old, mismatched chairs and a wooden table that looked like it had seen better days. The furniture was basic, nothing fancy, but it was exactly what I had been hoping for: simple and functional. A small kitchen sat off to the side, and a narrow staircase led up to a loft where the bedroom was located. The loft had a small window that overlooked the woods. I could already picture myself sitting there, sipping coffee in the morning while the world around me stayed quiet. I unpacked my things and decided to explore the area a bit. There was a creek nearby, the sound of it faintly reaching my ears. The forest seemed alive with movement, but there was no one around for miles. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world slip off my shoulders. That night, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep shade of purple, I settled in front of the fireplace with a book. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the cabin, and it was oddly comforting. The shadows of the trees outside seemed to stretch long across the yard, but I didn't pay much attention. The silence was soothing, not eerie, and I figured I'd enjoy the solitude for as long as it lasted. At some point, though, I noticed something strange. It was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that felt off. The wind had stopped, the chirping of crickets ceased, and there wasn't a sound to be heard. The fire crackled, but even that sound seemed muffled. My skin prickled, and I got up to check the windows. Outside, the night had swallowed the clearing whole. There was nothing to see but the dark shapes of the trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I dismissed the feeling as my imagination running wild. After all, I was alone in the middle of the woods, and it was easy to let my mind play tricks on me. But as I made my way back to the couch, I heard something, a soft, shuffling noise from outside. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. My heart skipped a beat. I stood there for a moment, frozen. It was so quiet that it felt like the world had stopped, and that noise was all that existed. I waited, listening for more, but the sound didn't come again. I told myself it was just an animal, a raccoon, or maybe a deer. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I made my way upstairs to the loft, trying to push the unease out of my mind. The bed was small but comfortable, and I pulled the covers over me, hoping that sleep would come quickly. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone in the cabin. It was a strange sensation, something I couldn't explain, but it gnawed at me. The darkness seemed thicker in here than it had been downstairs. I eventually fell into a restless sleep, tossing and turning through strange, disjointed dreams. When I woke the next morning, the sun was shining through the small window, casting a soft golden light over the room. I tried to shake off the strange feeling from the night before, telling myself it was just the isolation playing with my mind. I spent the next few days exploring the woods around the cabin, enjoying the peace. The days were warm, and I spent hours walking through the forest, following trails that seemed to stretch on forever. There was something peaceful about it all, the solitude, the stillness, the way the world seemed to slow down. But at night, when I returned to the cabin, I couldn't help but notice the subtle changes. The way the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too long, the way the wind would rustle the trees in a way that felt almost deliberate, and the noises, At first, I thought they were just animals, but they seemed different, more deliberate. Scratching sounds on the walls at night, faint footsteps outside the cabin. It was on the fourth night when things finally took a turn. I had just finished my dinner and was sitting by the fire, reading a book, when I heard it again. The scratching. This time it was louder, more persistent. It was coming from the outside, right against the wall of the cabin. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked to the window. There was nothing there, just the inky blackness of the woods. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something, scratching at the wood. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew louder. Scratching, tapping, and then a faint thud, like something or someone was trying to get inside. I locked all the doors and windows, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it someone playing a prank? A hunter? But why? I didn't know, and that uncertainty terrified me. I spent the rest of the night staring out the windows, watching for any sign of movement, but nothing came. The next morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The feeling of being watched, the strange noises, the unease that had settled in my chest. It was too much. I packed my things and left the cabin early, barely glancing at the woods one last time before I got into my car and drove away. As I drove down the narrow dirt path, I glanced back at the cabin in the rearview mirror. It was barely visible, swallowed up by the trees, but I swore I saw a figure standing on the porch. It was just a silhouette, but I could make out the outline of a person, tall, thin, with no clear features. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. I never went back to that cabin, and I never fully understood what happened during those days in the woods. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation driving me to paranoia? Or was there something or someone out there? The question still haunts me, but one thing is certain. I've never felt the need to escape to the woods again. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It had been a rough few months, and I needed to get away from everything. The noise, the endless messages, the pressure of daily life. A weekend in a secluded cabin sounded like the perfect escape. The place was tucked away in the woods, miles from the nearest town, in a place I'd never been before. The kind of place you could disappear in. The kind of place where no one could bother you. I drove up the narrow, winding road with the sun setting behind me. The air was crisp, fresh, and a little chilly, like it always is when you start to get into the forest. As the trees grew thicker, I felt a little surge of excitement. There was something about being in the wilderness that always gave me a sense of adventure, even if I was going to be alone. I reached the cabin just as the last light of the day faded. It was smaller than I expected, tucked in a hollow between two large pines. The cabin itself looked old but solid. Weathered wood, stone chimney, a porch that seemed to sag slightly in the middle. It was perfect. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and headed inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell, musty, but in a comforting way. The kind of smell you get when you're surrounded by wood and old books. The cabin had everything I needed. A small kitchen, a couple of worn chairs, a table, and a couch that looked like it had seen better days. There was a fireplace on one wall, and it was easy to imagine myself sitting there, reading a book or just listening to the crackle of the fire. I spent the first few hours settling in. I unpacked, made a quick dinner, and set up a fire in the fireplace. The light from the flames danced across the walls, casting long shadows. I sat in one of the chairs, watching the fire, listening to the occasional crack of wood splitting. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees rustle and creak. The night was coming on fast, and with it, the eerie quiet that falls when the world gets swallowed up by the woods. It was just me and the sounds of the forest now. I had no plans to leave the cabin until my weekend was over. I figured I'd spend my days reading, maybe taking short hikes, and simply enjoying the silence. But as I sat there, feeling the warmth of the fire, something began to gnaw at me. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the way the trees outside swayed in the wind. their limbs scratching at the walls of the cabin like something trying to get in. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the unease. I tried to brush it off. The cabin was locked up tight, and there was no one around for miles. But the feeling stuck with me. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more like a low-grade anxiety. Like something wasn't quite right, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. As the hours passed, the wind outside picked up. The trees moaned and groaned in the gusts, their branches scraping against the roof. The fire in the hearth crackled, but the sound was muffled by the wind. The occasional animal call broke the silence, but nothing too alarming. Still, the longer I sat there, the more I started to feel like I wasn't alone. It was probably just my nerves getting to me. I had been cooped up for too long, and this isolation was messing with my head. But even after I turned in for the night and pulled the covers over my head, the unease didn't go away. The darkness was complete, pressing in from all sides, and though the cabin was small and comforting, it felt distant, almost like it was closing in. I managed to fall asleep eventually, though it wasn't a deep sleep. I kept waking up, turning over, listening to the wind, the creaking of the wood. It wasn't long before I found myself wide awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the hair on the back of my neck prickle with tension. Then, at some point in the middle of the night, I heard it, a faint tapping. It was soft, rhythmic, almost like it was part of the wind, but not quite. A scratch, like someone tapping their fingers on the side of the cabin. It was so quiet, so subtle, that for a moment I thought it was just my imagination. But then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, straining to listen. Came from outside. The porch, maybe. I hadn't heard anything earlier, but now that I was awake, I couldn't ignore it. It was faint, but it was there. Tap, tap, tap. I got out of bed and pulled on my shoes. My mind raced, trying to come up with logical explanations. Could be an animal, I told myself. Maybe a branch or something brushing against the wood. But I wasn't sure. I went to the window, pulling the curtains aside slowly, trying not to make a sound. I scanned the area outside, my eyes searching the dark shadows where the trees met the cabin. Nothing. The tapping stopped. I stayed by the window, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I waited for what felt like hours, watching for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No more tapping, no more sounds. Just the wind and the quiet hum of the forest. Eventually, I went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. The tapping haunted my thoughts, and every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone, or something, standing just outside, watching me. The next morning, the sunlight streamed in through the windows, warm and comforting. I got up, made some coffee, and tried to shake off the unease that still clung to me. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. It wasn't unusual for the wind to make strange noises in a place like this. I spent the morning walking around the cabin, checking the perimeter. The door and windows were all locked, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of anyone or anything nearby. I figured I was just overthinking it. But the unease lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. I decided to take a hike that afternoon, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. I walked a trail that led deep into the woods, away from the cabin. The forest was thick with trees, the ground soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. It was peaceful, calming, but there was still that nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Around midday, I came across something that made my blood run cold. It was a small clearing just beyond a cluster of rocks. In the middle of it was a pile of broken branches and logs. At first, I thought it was just a natural debris pile, but when I stepped closer, I saw something strange. A rope. It was thick, weathered, and tangled around the pile of sticks. I kneeled down, running my fingers over it. It didn't look like something that had been left by nature. It looked deliberate. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, half expecting someone to step out from behind a tree. But the clearing was empty still. I backed away slowly, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. Something wasn't right. I rushed back to the cabin, my thoughts racing. Who would leave something like that out here? The cabin was isolated, but there were other houses in the area, maybe some kind of trap or signal. I couldn't ignore the fact that it felt like I was being watched. That night, the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't just a tap. It was louder, more insistent, like someone was banging on the door. I froze, heart racing. The sound was unmistakable now. Someone was on the porch. I stayed perfectly still, trying to listen. The wind outside howled through the trees, but the tapping didn't stop. It was like whoever or whatever was out there was trying to get in. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands shaking. I didn't know what I was going to do if someone was out there. Should I call the police? I didn't even know if I had cell service out here. My mind raced with possibilities, but I couldn't just sit there. I stepped cautiously to the door, listening for any sound. The tapping stopped as soon as I moved. I cracked open the door, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The porch was empty. Nothing. Just the stillness of the night. I closed the door quickly and locked it, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. But the relief was short-lived. Something didn't feel right. It wasn't the tapping. It was something else. A feeling of being cornered, trapped, like I was being stalked, but by something I couldn't see. The forest had grown silent, and the air felt thick, oppressive. I sat in the chair by the fire, heart still pounding. It was quiet, but the silence was unnerving. Then, after what felt like hours, I finally drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't care that I hadn't stayed the whole weekend. I didn't care that I hadn't gotten the rest I needed. The unease that had settled in my chest was unbearable. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin disappearing behind me. I had no idea who had been there or why they were watching. But one thing was for sure, I wouldn't be coming back.